On the morning of August 16, 1941, the German submarine U-48 slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, and 35 men vanished into a realm that has never fully given up its secrets. We know they went down. We know they hunted. We know that their commanding officer, a man named Hans-Rudolf Rösing, would emerge from that same sea with a record that bordered on the extraordinary. But what remains shrouded, what persists in the mist and memory, is the question that haunts all deep-sea narratives. How does one teach others to survive in an environment that demands constant confrontation with death? How does a man rise through impossible circumstances, not by being the loudest or the fastest, but by quietly understanding something about courage that others could only learn by following him? These are the questions that draw us into the long, grey corridors of the Second World War's Atlantic theatre. The Atlantic in those years was not a place of adventure, despite what the stories sometimes suggest. It was a place of profound monotony, interrupted by moments of pure terror. Waves rose and fell in endless succession. Fog settled so thickly that a man standing at the bow of a ship could barely see the stern. The water temperature in those northern latitudes promised death within minutes if one were unlucky enough to find oneself in it. And yet, beneath that surface, beneath the churn and the cold and the perpetual darkness, there existed a world that was even more isolated, even more claustrophobic, and infinitely more strange. It was the world of the submarine. It was the world that would define an entire generation of men who would never quite be understood by those who remained on land. If you find yourself drawn to the untold dimensions of wartime naval history, to the stories of men who shaped battles from beneath the waves, while others took the credit on the surface, I warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel. We dive deeply, and I do mean deeply, into the lives and legacies of those who commanded the underwater war, and Hans-Rudolf Rösing is one of the most revealing cases through which to understand how leadership, strategy, and human character intertwine during humanity's darkest chapters. Let us begin where all proper journeys into this history must begin, with the sea itself. Picture it. The year is 1940, though it could have been 1941 or 1942, because the grey Atlantic looked much the same in every month of those years. The swell rises and falls in a rhythm that has not changed since before memory began. There is no sound, really, except the hiss of wind and the endless percussion of water against water. The light, what little there is, comes through a thickness that seems almost solid. This is the Atlantic that men from Germany, England, America, and a dozen other nations came to know intimately. This is the Atlantic that received their ships, sometimes gently, sometimes with violence, and sometimes with an indifference so complete that it hardly mattered whether a man perished by shellfire or by the simple fact of exposure. The surface tells you one story, a story of vastness, of horizon lines that stretch beyond comprehension, of forces so large that human ambition seems almost comical by comparison. But sailors knew that the real drama, the real struggle, played out beneath that surface, where sunlight could not reach, where pressure increased with every meter of descent, where a single error in navigation or judgment could mean the difference between fame and oblivion. They knew, those sailors, that the true masters of that realm were the men in the submarines, not because they were braver or stronger than their surface-dwelling counterparts, but because they had chosen to make their war in a medium that demanded a different kind of thinking altogether. The submarine was not a vessel designed for conquest in the traditional sense. It was a tool of infiltration, of ambush, of careful calculation. A U-boat captain did not win through direct confrontation the way a destroyer captain might. He won through patience, through the ability to read the water, through an almost intuitive understanding of where his prey would be and what path it would take. And perhaps most importantly, he won through his capacity to teach others, to transform ordinary conscripts into reliable crew members who could function in an environment where panic was the only true enemy. This is where our story begins in earnest, not in some glorious moment of combat, but in the quieter spaces where professionalism was born, not on the bridge of a ship under attack, but in the training grounds of occupied France, in the classrooms and simulators where a new generation of commanders learned their craft. We are about to trace the trajectory of one man, Hans-Rudolf Rösing, who would become legendary, not necessarily because he sank the most tonnage or won the most visible battles, though his record in that regard was certainly respectable. He would become legendary because he understood something about how to prepare people for the worst, about how to maintain standards when the entire system around him was beginning to crumble, about how to mentor and shape young men who would then carry that teaching out into the Atlantic, where they would prove themselves again and again. The waves continue their endless motion, the fog rolls in and out according to its own logic. Time moves differently at sea, and even more differently beneath it. A day in a submarine can stretch into something that feels like a week. A moment of crisis can compress into something that feels like a single held breath. And in between these extremes, there is a vast, grey middle territory where men learn to trust each other completely, or not at all, and where a single officer's clarity of thought could mean the difference between a crew that performed its duties with precision and a crew that descended into the kind of panic that leads only to ruin. Somewhere in this grey Atlantic, somewhere in the endless cycling of the depth gauge, somewhere in the precise calculations of bearings and distances, there was a man listening to the reports of his sonarmen, studying the shape of the waves above, considering the temperature gradients of the water around him. This man had a name. It was Hans-Rudolf Rösing. And his story is not one of solitary genius or single brilliant moments, but rather one of accumulated wisdom, of patient teaching, of a career that bent and shifted with the fortunes of war, and of an influence that extended far beyond his own patrol record into the very DNA of how an entire submarine force would be trained, shaped, and prepared for their missions. That teaching extended into the post-war years, and in some sense, it extends into this very moment, because the principles he embodied, discipline, clarity, the commitment to preserving human life even in the midst of combat, these do not fade with the passing of time. They only grow quieter, as though waiting beneath the surface to be remembered once more. There is a particular kind of officer who appears only rarely in the archives of naval warfare, a man whose greatest victories were never measured in tonnage sunk or convoys destroyed, but rather in the quiet competence of others who lived to fight another day because of what he taught them. Such a figure walked the corridors of the German Kriegsmarine during the Second World War, and his story is one that unfolds not across a single dramatic patrol or a celebrated battle, but across 2 decades of service to the sea in ways both visible and utterly invisible to those who never knew him. Hans-Rudolf Rösing was a man of paradox. He would command one of the most successful U-boats ever to prowl the Atlantic, accumulating the kind of record that lesser officers might have spent their entire war chasing. Yet it is not primarily for those sunken ships that history might remember him, if it remembers him at all. Instead, his true legacy lies in the dozens of younger captains whose first commands succeeded, not because of luck or recklessness, but because Rösing had spent countless hours drilling them in the cold mathematics of submarine warfare, teaching them to read the ocean as one reads a text written in currents and shadows and the faint hum of distant propellers. What makes a career remarkable is not always what we expect to find remarkable. We tend to venerate the commander who sank the most tonnage, the officer whose name became synonymous with daring. But submarine warfare, you see, was a different kind of contest entirely. It was not a sport of individual heroism, though heroes certainly existed within it. It was a grinding war of probabilities, of patience, of training so thorough that a young captain faced with a moment of decision beneath the waves would not pause to think, but would act with the certainty of someone who had rehearsed that moment 100 times in calm water before ever approaching the enemy. Rösing's unusual path took him from the cramped control room of his own command to the administrative buildings of occupied France, where he would oversee the transformation of eager young naval officers into efficient hunters. And perhaps this transition This movement away from personal glory toward the cultivation of others tells us something about the kind of man he was. The ocean, after all, is indifferent to our ambitions. It does not care whether we seek fame or seek merely to ensure that those under our command return to port alive. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, narratives that wind through the grey complexity of history rather than following the bright arc of a single dramatic moment, then consider subscribing to this channel, where we explore the deep histories of the Second World War with the kind of attention and unhurried pace that these stories deserve. We move slowly through these waters so that you might understand not just what happened, but how it felt to live within these events, and what we might learn from those who navigated them with skill and, when possible, with conscience. But let us return now to our subject, to the early life of this man before the war would reshape everything, before he would stand at the threshold between one kind of service and another. For to understand Rösing, we must first understand the Germany into which he was born, a nation convulsing with change, with the memory of one terrible war still fresh in the minds of all adults, and with a strange, secret hope stirring in certain naval circles that the traditions of undersea warfare might be resurrected from their enforced grave. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the spring of 1919, drew a line through European history with the finality of a blade through silk. For Germany, that treaty was not merely a diplomatic document. It was a humiliation carved into the very flesh of the nation, a deliberate dismantling of military pride that would echo through 2 decades of resentment and silence. And among the clauses that struck deepest, there was one that seemed almost surgical in its cruelty. The German Navy, once a formidable instrument of imperial power, was reduced to a handful of aging vessels, permitted no submarines whatsoever, no aircraft carriers, no ships of significant tonnage. The great fleet that had challenged British supremacy was rendered, by treaty, into little more than a constabulary force. One might wonder how a nation so thoroughly disarmed in the seas could possibly rebuild what was taken. The answer lies not in defiance or loud proclamation, but in secrecy, patience, and a kind of technical ingenuity born from necessity. Germany did not roar back onto the world stage. Instead, it whispered. It planned in shadows and executed in the spaces between legality and deception. The 1920s were years of profound quiet in German naval circles. Officers who had commanded battleships during the Great War found themselves relegated to smaller vessels or relegated to desk work, their expertise seemingly obsolete in a nation stripped of naval ambition. Yet beneath this surface calm, something far more calculated was taking place. The German military establishment had not abandoned the idea of submarines. Rather, they had simply driven it underground, quite literally, into the realm of technical studies and theoretical papers and secret arrangements with distant nations. In the decade following Versailles, Germany could not build submarines within its own borders without violating the treaty. But it could think about submarines. It could study the designs that had been used during the First World War, analyze what had worked and what had failed, and imagine how future undersea vessels might be improved. Officers like those who would guide the next generation, including eventually Hans-Rudolf Rösing himself, began their mental apprenticeship in this strange interregnum, where the past was mourned and the future was sketched in confidential memoranda. The German Navy's leadership during this period, men acutely aware of their nation's constraints, began a patient campaign of technical preparation. They established what appeared to be civilian companies and research organizations, entities that existed in the margins of legality. One such venture was the Submarine Design Bureau, established in collaboration with Dutch engineers in the Netherlands, far from the eyes of treaty inspectors. Another took shape in Finland, a country with its own reasons to remain on cordial terms with Germany and less direct oversight from the treaty powers. Through these channels, German naval architects continued to refine submarine theory, to conduct experiments that could never be conducted on German soil, to dream in iron and electric motors and torpedoes. One must pause here and consider what this meant for men like Rösing, officers who came of age during this strangled period. They inherited a tradition of naval excellence that had no outlet. They studied a history of the submarine campaigns of the Great War, where bold commanders had nearly strangled British supply lines, and they understood that this weapon had not lost its potential merely because a treaty said so. Rather, the potential had been forced into dormancy, where it accumulated pressure like steam in a sealed chamber. By the early 1930s, the political climate in Germany had begun to shift in ways that would allow this pressure to release. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party represented, among many other things, a deliberate rejection of the constraints of Versailles. Hitler understood that military power required not just ideological fervor, but technical capability, and submarines occupied a peculiar place in his strategic imagination. They were expensive, they required highly skilled crews, but they were also difficult for an enemy to defend against, and their very existence represented a kind of technological audacity that appealed to him. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935 was, from one perspective, a shocking normalization of relations between two powers that might otherwise have remained bitter rivals. From another perspective, it was a masterstroke of diplomatic maneuvering by Germany. The agreement permitted Germany to maintain a submarine fleet up to 35% of British submarine tonnage. It was, in essence, a treaty that officially sanctioned what had previously been done in secret. Germany could now, openly and with international sanction, begin building submarines again. The change was immediate and profound. The secret studies, the theoretical papers, the designs developed in hidden laboratories abroad, all of these suddenly became practical blueprints for actual construction. Shipyards that had been dormant or repurposed now began the work of building U-boats, the vessels that would soon bear the name of Germany's submarine fleet. The first new German submarines, built under the terms of this agreement, began to slide into the water in late 1935 and into 1936. They were sleek, modern vessels, embodying decades of accumulated knowledge about submarine warfare and naval engineering. They represented, in a very real sense, the culmination of all those quiet years of preparation and secret study. For officers entering the submarine service at this moment, there was a peculiar sensation of witnessing both rebirth and vindication. The weapon that their nation's naval traditions held sacred was being reborn. The men who would command these vessels, who would train the crews who would operate them, who would gradually build an entire culture of submarine warfare around them, these men understood that they were participating in something historically significant, even if they could not yet articulate exactly what that significance would become. The transition from this period of secret preparation to the actual launching of a submarine construction program represented a crucial threshold. It marked the moment when German naval ambitions, constrained but not destroyed by Versailles, could begin to take physical form. It was also the moment when men like Hans-Rudolf Rösing would discover their true vocation, the element in which their talents would come to full expression. The sea had been waiting for them, or perhaps they had been waiting for the sea. Either way, the moment of their meeting was drawing near, suspended in that strange twilight between peacetime and the gathering storms of the late 1930s. To understand how a man becomes captain of the sea, we must first know the boy who heard its distant call. Hans-Rudolf Rösing entered the world in 1908, born into a Germany that was still reaching toward empire, still confident in the old certainties. His father, Rudolf Rösing Sr., came from a Prussian family of modest but respectable standing, the kind of household where discipline and duty were not spoken of loudly because they were simply the air one breathed, not wealthy, but comfortable, not connected to the highest circles of power, but present in the steady infrastructure of a nation rebuilding itself after the losses of the Great War. The years of his childhood unfolded in northern Germany, in that landscape of soft horizons and grey skies where the sea was never truly distant, even when invisible. There is something about growing up near the coast, even when you do not live upon it, that shapes the geography of a child's imagination. The sea becomes a presence felt rather than seen. a pull that draws the mind outward, beyond the familiar boundaries of home and school. Young Hans Rudolf would have known, as all German children near the coast knew, that his country's naval glory had once been immense, that Kaiser Wilhelm's battleships had ruled the North Sea not so very long ago. These were stories told in classrooms and around dinner tables, stories with the weight of recent memory, not distant legend. The Weimar years, as Rösing entered his adolescence, carried a peculiar shame and stubborn pride. Germany had been forbidden a navy worthy of its history. The Treaty of Versailles had drawn a line through German military ambition, and the surface fleet was constrained to a shadow of its former self. But the submarine existed in a strange legal ambiguity. It was spoken of in whispers among naval officers, in technical journals read behind closed doors. To a boy in the 1920s who had inherited a family tradition of service, and who felt, perhaps without fully understanding why, drawn to the sea, the submarine represented something, possibility perhaps, or a kind of defiance wrapped in engineering and silence. By the time Rösing reached his teenage years, Germany itself was beginning to shift beneath the surface. The economic collapse of the late 20s, the rise of a new kind of politics, the slow rearmament that everyone could sense but few openly discussed. These currents moved through German society like the undertow beneath visible waves. His family would have been aware of these shifts, as educated, dutiful Germans were aware, but such matters would not have been the center of a boy's world. What would have mattered more, in the quiet hours when a young man begins to know his own nature, was the question that forms itself without words: who am I to become? For Rösing, the answer seemed to whisper from the north, from the cold waters and the grey horizons. He appears to have shown early interest in naval matters, the kind of attention that marks a boy who has found the thread of his own destiny. Not recklessness or romantic fantasy, but something quieter and more persistent, a genuine pull toward maritime life, toward ships and seamanship, and the discipline of the sea. Whether this came from family influence, from the lingering prestige of naval service in Prussian culture, or from something deeper in his own temperament, we cannot say with certainty. Perhaps it was all three, woven together in the way that childhood inclinations always are. What we do know is that by his late adolescence, Rösing had committed himself to a path that would shape every year of his life to follow. He would seek entry into the Navy. Not the merchant service, though that too was a respectable calling for a young man of his background, but the military service, the Kriegsmarine, as it was now called, stripped and constrained as it was by the treaty that had humiliated the nation. There was something almost stubborn about this choice, something that suggests a young man who could see past the immediate limitations of his era towards something that might emerge. The Germany he was preparing to serve was not yet the Germany it would become. Rösing was still a youth when the Nazi Party was gathering its energies in beer halls and political meetings. His formative years had been shaped by the Republic, by the attempt, however flawed, to build something new from the wreckage of imperial collapse. The pull toward service, toward duty, toward the structures of military life that he inherited from his family, these were rooted in older traditions, in the professional military culture that existed before and would outlast, in many ways, the ideology that would come to dominate his nation. To consider his childhood is to see a young man being drawn toward a specific kind of life, one of order, of technical knowledge, of the peculiar intensity that submarine service demands. The sea itself would be his first teacher, though he did not yet know it. His family had provided the foundation, the discipline, the sense of purpose, the belief that duty was something to aspire to rather than resent. Everything that would come after, all the decisions and the commands and the moments when he would shape the futures of other men, had their roots in these quiet years of preparation. When Hans Rudolf Rösing turned his gaze toward the sea as a young man, the German Navy existed only in fragments and careful denial. The Kriegsmarine of the late 1920s was a shadow service, constrained by the Treaty of Versailles to a handful of aging ships and perhaps 6,000 men, a force designed to police coastal waters, nothing more. And yet, within that narrow permission, Germany had begun to preserve something precious: the knowledge and discipline of seamanship itself, the traditions, the techniques, the unbroken thread of naval culture that would one day be woven into something far larger. Rösing, in his early 20s, could not have known the scale of what was coming. He knew only that the sea called, and that the uniform represented order, hierarchy, and a path upward through merit and duty. His entry into formal naval service came through the pathway that had shaped German officers for generations: the cadet system. Young men of suitable background, having passed examinations in mathematics, languages, and general knowledge, were gathered into academies where the real education began. Not the kind of education found in books, though there were plenty of those. Rather, the slow and deliberate molding of the mind toward obedience, precision, and the internalization of naval discipline so complete that it became almost invisible. A cadet did not choose to stand at attention, or to maintain silence during meals, or to memorize the nomenclature of every rope and fitting aboard a training vessel. These things simply became the rhythm of existence, the water in which he swam. The cadet corps, even in this diminished post-war era, maintained rigorous standards. Physical hardship was considered character building, and perhaps it was. Long marches in heavy weather, cold water immersions, inadequate sleep punctuated by surprise drills at night. A young man learned that his body could endure far more than his mind believed possible. More subtly, he learned that comfort and warmth were privileges to be earned, not rights to be assumed. This created a particular type of officer, someone who could function effectively when exhausted, hungry, and afraid. Someone who had already surrendered certain luxuries and therefore could face deprivation without the shock of loss. Rösing appears to have thrived in this environment, though the historical record offers only glimpses. His fellow cadets remembered him as quiet but competent, neither brilliant nor struggling, a man who grasped instructions quickly and executed them without complaint. There are no accounts of him being exceptionally popular or isolated. He occupied the middle ground where a young officer could be most effective, visible enough to be noticed by superiors, unobtrusive enough to avoid the jealousy of peers. This was perhaps the first real shaping of his character as a leader. Not charisma, not exceptional intellect, but rather a kind of steady reliability that made others believe he could be trusted with responsibility. The Naval Academy curriculum of those years, whether at Murvik in Schleswig-Holstein, where the most elite officers trained, or at the smaller establishments where promising youths were developed for regular service, followed patterns established in the 19th century. Navigation, seamanship, gunnery, naval history, international law. There was Latin and philosophy, intended to broaden the mind toward understanding the continuity of German naval tradition. Instructors were often former officers from the World War, men still young enough to remember the old Imperial Navy before the collapse of 1918. They carried within them a particular kind of nostalgia, mixed with careful optimism about what might be rebuilt. Whether they spoke it directly, or whether it filtered through in tone and emphasis, their young charges understood that they were being prepared for something larger than current circumstances suggested. But perhaps the deepest education came not in the classroom, it came in the hours spent aboard the training ships, the old cruisers and auxiliary vessels that still served the Kriegsmarine in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Here, on the open sea, the North Sea, the Baltic, the Atlantic approaches, a cadet learned the actual sensation of naval life. The rhythm of watches changing every 4 hours, the constant vigilance required to keep a ship moving smoothly through variable conditions, the way that salt spray penetrated everything, the way that wet wool smelled, the particular exhaustion that came from standing on a heaving deck for hours at a time, learning to read the water's moods. There was something almost meditative about this training. When viewed from sufficient distance, a young man would stand at the helm or work on deck, performing repetitive tasks under the eye of petty officers and senior ratings. The motion of the ship became internalized. His body learned to move with the deck rather than against it. His eyes learned to read the water itself, the slope of the waves, the color of the surface, the subtle signs of wind shift or current change. All of this was taught through demonstration and correction, rarely through formal instruction. An officer needed this knowledge to move through a warship as if it were an extension of his own body, to give commands that the crew would execute smoothly without hesitation or confusion. And there was discipline, always discipline, but not merely the parade ground sort, though there was plenty of that. Rather, the discipline of attention, the requirement to observe everything, to understand not only what was being done, but why it was being done that way. A senior officer would watch a cadet's face as they watched a maneuver being executed. Were they truly seeing, or merely looking? Did they understand the principles, or were they simply memorizing steps? This was where character could be evaluated, where an officer was being formed, not through punishment or praise, though those existed, but through the subtle pressure of constant awareness that one's attention was itself being scrutinized. By the time Rösing completed his initial training period, probably around 1930 or 1931, he had absorbed certain truths at a level deeper than conscious memory. He understood that the sea was indifferent to human will, and that success at sea required working with natural forces rather than against them. He had learned that orders must be precise and unambiguous, and that the men who carried out those orders deserved clarity and respect in return. He had developed a tolerance for physical discomfort and a capacity for focused attention during long, monotonous stretches. Perhaps most importantly, he had learned that naval tradition was not merely ceremonial but functional, that the rituals and formalities that governed shipboard life existed because they had been refined through centuries of experience to maximize safety and efficiency in environments where mistakes could be fatal. The question of what truly motivates a young man to choose naval service remains elusive, even for those who lived through those years. Was it patriotism in the nationalist sense, that fervent belief in German destiny that was growing stronger as political winds shifted? Or was it something simpler, the appeal of structure and purpose, the clarity of hierarchy and role, the beauty of a ship under sail or steam? For many of the officers who would serve under Rösing later, who would learn from him and respect him, the answer was probably both, layered and inseparable. They believed in Germany, and they loved the sea. They wanted to be excellent at their craft. These motivations did not feel contradictory to them, not yet. The early 1930s were a strange transitional period for the German Navy. The restrictions of Versailles remained officially in place, yet secretly the groundwork was being laid for rearmament. In 1935, this would become open and formal. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement would allow Germany to build submarines again, to openly pursue the expansion that had already begun in shadows. But before that official revelation, young officers like Rösing were being trained in the assumption that their service was temporary, that the current constraints would not persist indefinitely, that the day would come when Germany would reclaim its place as a naval power. This assumption was not always stated directly. It did not need to be. It hung in the air like the salt spray on a North Sea training ship, inseparable from everything else. By the time Rösing received his commission as a junior officer, probably in 1932, he had been shaped by this environment into a particular type of man, competent, disciplined, reliable, and carrying within himself an unexamined belief in the inevitability of national renewal and the rightness of German aspirations. Whether he questioned this belief, whether he harbored doubts, remains unknown to history. What is certain is that he had internalized the values and methods of the officer corps, that he understood how to lead men, and that he possessed the technical knowledge of seamanship and naval practice. The sea had claimed a small part of him, as it does with all those who serve upon it, and the Navy, in return, had claimed most of the rest. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany's navy in ruins, its capital ships scuttled or surrendered, its submarines forbidden entirely by the terms of that document signed in the Hall of Mirrors. But treaties, as history whispers, are only as binding as the will of those who enforce them. And in the years between the wars, when the world turned inward and the great powers watched each other with tired suspicion, Germany began to rebuild what had been taken from it, quietly, methodically, in the shadows of international diplomacy and secret negotiations that few outside the highest military circles would ever know. By the late 1920s, when Rösing was completing his training as a surface officer, the Kriegsmarine had begun to reshape itself. The Navy could not build battleships. The treaty forbade it, at least for now. But submarines existed in a legal grey space, a technical loophole that German officers and engineers approached with the patience of men solving an intricate puzzle. They could not build them in German shipyards where prying eyes might observe. So they looked elsewhere, in Spain, in Finland, in the Netherlands, in secret arrangements that official records would never quite capture. The development of undersea warfare technology began again, as if the Great War had merely paused rather than ended. This was the world Rösing stepped into, not with fanfare, but with the quiet pragmatism of a professional who understood that his nation's future lay in directions that could not yet be spoken aloud. The Kriegsmarine, forbidden from the waters that had once been its domain, turned its attention downward, toward the depths. And if submarines were forbidden, then they would be designed and tested elsewhere, their crews trained in locations where no international inspector could demand access. The arrangement was delicate and required a certain kind of officer, one who could work in secrecy without complaint, who could understand the necessity of discretion, who could train men in skills that official documents claimed did not yet exist. Rösing possessed these qualities in abundance. By temperament and training, he was suited to this clandestine work. There was no glory in it, no public recognition, only the steady accumulation of knowledge and the slow birth of an institution that would, in time, reshape the naval war to come. In the early 1930s, submarine development moved forward in carefully hidden increments. Designs were refined in drawing offices in Berlin and Hamburg. Models were tested in secluded tanks. And in 1933, with Hitler's rise to power and the sudden acceleration of German rearmament, the pretense of adhering to Versailles began to dissolve. The future was being written in steel and oil, and the patient training of men who would soon inherit a new kind of warfare. Rösing's first direct involvement in U-boat operations came through a posting that seemed unremarkable on the surface, but carried profound implications beneath. He was assigned to oversee aspects of submarine training and development, roles that required him to understand not just the theoretical principles of undersea warfare, but the practical realities of how men behaved when sealed in metal cylinders, descending into darkness. How did panic manifest itself? How could discipline be maintained when the walls seemed to close inward? How did a crew learn to function as a single organism in a space so confined that privacy became an abstract concept? These were the questions that occupied Rösing's mind as he moved through the shadowy infrastructure of the submarine service being reborn. He studied the records of the old imperial U-boat campaigns, reading accounts written by men who had commanded in the Atlantic during the Great War, understanding what had worked and what had failed. He examined the technical innovations that had emerged in submarine design since those desperate years, the improvements in diesel engines, in hull construction, in the precision of periscopes and torpedo mechanisms. And he began to formulate in his mind a vision of how the next generation of submarine commanders should be trained. What they needed to know not just about machinery, but about leadership, endurance, the psychology of men operating in conditions of perpetual danger. In the mid-1930s, Rösing found himself involved in efforts that took him beyond Germany's borders, to locations where the facade of adherence to international treaties could be more easily maintained. There were training exercises conducted at sea in areas designated as research operations. There were liaison posts in countries sympathetic to German rearmament, where technical knowledge could be exchanged and young officers could gain practical experience with submarines that officially did not yet exist under German colours. It was during one of these clandestine training deployments that Rösing first descended into a submarine during an actual operation, not a drill or a demonstration, but a real patrol, where the possibility of enemy contact, however remote in those still peaceful waters, could not be entirely dismissed. The experience left an indelible impression. The sensory disorientation of submarine life, the absolute dependency on machinery that must function perfectly in an environment utterly hostile to human presence, the strange isolation that comes from knowing that the vast ocean surrounds you with only a thin steel wall between survival and catastrophe. These were things that could not be fully understood from technical manuals or theoretical discussions. They had to be experienced, had to be felt in the body, had to become part of the knowing that shaped how a man thought about command and responsibility. What struck Rösing most profoundly was not the danger, though danger was certainly present, but rather the profound discipline required of the men who operated these vessels. A U-boat crew could number anywhere from 40 to 50 men, depending on the class of vessel, and all of them were dependent on the actions of every other member. The captain gave the orders, but the engineering officer, who maintained the delicate balance of buoyancy, was equally critical to survival. The torpedoman who ensured the weapons were loaded correctly, the quartermaster who maintained position and course, the signalman who received wireless communications. Every role mattered absolutely. There could be no slacking, no complacency, no moment of inattention that might cascade into catastrophe. This realization shaped Rösing's emerging philosophy of submarine command. It was not enough to be a competent officer. You had to understand the intimate dependencies that bound a crew together. You had to recognize that leadership beneath the surface was fundamentally different from leadership on a surface ship, where men could move about, where the sky was visible, where the normal rhythms of day and night could still be observed. In a submarine, all of that was stripped away. Men lived by artificial light, by the rhythms imposed by military routine rather than the sun, in proximity so close that the slightest interpersonal friction could become a corrosive force over weeks at sea. By the late 1930s, as war clouds darkened over Europe and Germany openly repudiated the Treaty of Versailles, the submarine service expanded rapidly. The prohibition on U-boats was abandoned. New construction began in German shipyards. The clandestine development of the previous years was transformed into an open program of naval expansion. And Rösing, who had spent years in the shadowy borderlands between official denial and practical reality, found himself positioned as a bridge between the theoretical knowledge accumulated during the hidden years and the practical necessities of building and maintaining a fleet of submarines that would soon be required to fight. He had seen the machines being born, understood the principles that guided their design, grasped the human dimensions of life within them, and he had begun to understand something else, something more subtle and more important perhaps, that the success of a submarine service depended not primarily on the quality of individual machines or even individual commanders, but rather on the creation of a system of training and knowledge transfer that could rapidly prepare young officers for the extraordinary demands of undersea command. The war that was coming would require not just a few exceptional captains, but a constantly replenished stream of capable commanders, and those men would have to be trained by someone who understood not just the technical requirements, but the human and psychological dimensions of the task. Rösing had begun his career as a surface officer, learning the traditional disciplines of the Imperial Navy in an institution that still carried the weight of 19th century hierarchy and procedure. But through his years of involvement in the rebirth of the submarine service, he had undergone a quiet transformation. He was becoming something different, something that had not existed in German naval culture before, a man who understood submarines not just as weapons but as communities, as systems of human organization and technical expertise that had to be carefully constructed and continuously refined. That understanding would shape everything that came after and would ultimately define his legacy, not as a great captain, though U-48 would certainly gain considerable fame, but as something perhaps more valuable and more enduring, as a teacher and a builder of institutions. The summer of 1939 arrived with a peculiar tension across Europe, a kind of held breath before something immense and irreversible. For the men of the Kriegsmarine, for officers like Rösing who had spent years in the carefully controlled choreography of peacetime exercises and theoretical drills, The weeks leading up to September 1st carried a strange electricity. The training scenarios that had filled notebooks and blackboards were about to become something far more consequential. The Atlantic, which had been a kind of stage for practice, was becoming a hunting ground. When Hitler's forces crossed into Poland, in those first grey hours of September 1st, the world that Rösing had known for his entire adult life fractured. The careful, hierarchical rituals of the Kriegsmarine, the inspections and the salutes, and the long planning sessions in offices overlooking the Baltic, all of it suddenly seemed to belong to a different era, even as that era was only hours old. The war that had seemed simultaneously inevitable and distant had arrived with the terrible certainty of something long expected finally occurring. For a naval officer, particularly one whose entire career had been oriented toward a conflict he knew was coming, there was an odd kind of calm in that moment. The waiting was finished. Rösing's position in those early weeks placed him in a curious space. He was not yet commanding his own boat. The U-boat fleet that Germany possessed was still relatively modest, fewer than 60 submarines actually operational, or nearly so, when the war began. The expansion, the vast breeding ground of undersea warfare that would eventually see hundreds of boats built and sent to sea, was still only in the blueprints and the minds of admirals. What existed in September of 1939 was a force that was small but intensely trained, men who had been prepared for this moment through years of careful, methodical instruction. These were not the desperate conscripts of the later years. These were volunteers, professionals, officers who understood the peculiar demands of underwater warfare. The first weeks of the war were strange in their own way. There was no immediate mad rush of submarines toward the Atlantic. The initial German strategy, if one could call it that, was still forming itself in the minds of the naval command. Where should the boats go? How should they be deployed? The war that everyone had anticipated was unfolding in ways that did not always match the expectations. Britain and France had declared war, but the great naval battles that some had imagined did not immediately materialize. Instead, there was a period of cautious probing, of submarines being sent out to test the waters, to feel out where the British Navy was positioned, to begin the slow work of disruption and hunting that would eventually become the Battle of the Atlantic. For Rösing, these early weeks involved preparation of a different kind. If he was not yet commanding, he was mentoring, training, helping to ready the officers and men who would take the boats out. There was a feverish quality to this work, because everyone understood that the window for careful preparation was closing. The war that had seemed theoretical in the offices of the Kriegsmarine was now happening in real time, and every day brought new demands, new urgencies. The boats that existed needed to be fully crewed. The men who would serve aboard them needed to understand not just the mechanics of their duties, but the profound psychological demands of war beneath the waves. The shift from peacetime drills to actual operations was not instantaneous. Have you ever noticed how major changes often announce themselves gradually through a series of small alterations that only later seem momentous? So it was in the autumn of 1939. The exercises continued, but now they carried a different weight. The scenarios that had been theoretical became practice runs for actual patrols. The men who went through the training knew, with a kind of collective awareness that did not need to be stated, that they might not return. The submarines that had been painted in the colors used for display were being given a different kind of camouflage. The torpedoes that had been handled with the care one uses for expensive equipment were now being loaded with the knowledge that they would be fired at real targets, at ships carrying real people. By October, the first successes were being reported. German submarines, feeling their way through the waters off Britain, were finding merchant vessels. The war at sea was beginning to take shape. It would eventually become something far more vast and complex than anyone could have imagined in those early months. A grinding, murderous business that would consume resources and lives in quantities that seemed almost abstract when contemplated in those first autumn weeks. But in late 1939, it was still new, still being defined, still carrying that element of discovery and uncertainty that makes the beginning of any great conflict both terrible and, in some ways that history rarely acknowledges, oddly fascinating to those who lived through it. Rösing himself was preparing for a change. The administrative and training work that had occupied so much of his recent years was still necessary, more necessary than ever, in fact, as the Navy scrambled to expand its submarine force. But he knew that his path would eventually lead to command at sea. The peacetime officer in him was giving way to something else. The meticulous planner was about to become a hunter. The instructor was about to become a warrior. Not immediately, perhaps, but the trajectory was clear, and the war that had just begun was pulling him, like all men of his profession, toward the destiny he had been trained for his entire life to fulfill. The Atlantic in the autumn of 1939 was a different ocean than it had been the summer before. The same water, the same currents, the same grey waves and cold mists. But now there were hunters beneath the surface. Now there was blood in the water, metaphorically speaking, the blood of merchant ships torn apart by torpedoes, of crews dying in the cold, of supplies meant for Britain sinking to the bottom where no one could retrieve them. And there were men in grey uniforms, in cramped steel boats, learning to navigate this new reality, learning to kill, learning to survive, learning that the theoretical war they had prepared for was far different from the one actually happening and far more consequential than any drill could have suggested. When Rösing took command of U-48 in the early months of 1941, he inherited not merely a vessel, but a particular kind of floating world, one that had already begun to earn a quiet reputation among the captains and crews of the German submarine service. The boat itself was a Type Vic, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's undersea fleet, built to exacting specifications in the Hamburg yards, its hull welded with a precision that would have to withstand pressures that could crush a man's chest in an instant. U-48 had already seen action under previous commands, and its crew, the core of them at least, carried with them the unspoken knowledge of what lay ahead, the rhythm of the hunting grounds they knew by sound as much as by chart. The command of a submarine is an exercise in radical discipline, a kind of orchestrated silence that begins before the boat ever slips beneath the surface. Rösing understood this with the certainty of a man who had studied both the technical manuals and the quieter lessons of seamanship, passed between officers in wardrooms and over maps lit by oil lamp. A U-boat is not commanded through shouting or visible gestures. It is commanded through a clarity of intention so complete that the crew anticipates rather than reacts. Every man aboard, from the chief engineer deep in the motor compartment to the sonar listener hunched in the control room, becomes an extension of a single, focused consciousness. That consciousness was now Rösing. Below the surface, at depth, the submarine becomes something almost alive in a different way than ships on the open water. The pressure of the Atlantic, the crushing weight of thousands of tons of seawater pressing against steel walls only inches thick, creates a kind of forced intimacy that reshapes how men think and speak and move. There is no privacy on a U-boat, not in any meaningful sense. A man cannot turn away from his crewmates, cannot retreat into solitude, cannot pretend that the others are not there breathing the same recycled air, sweating into the same damp that accumulates on every metal surface like a living thing. The boats were typically crewed by around 50 men, packed into a steel cylinder less than 200 feet long, where the passage between sections required squeezing sideways through oval hatches and climbing over the torpedoes stacked in their racks. And yet, or perhaps because of this, there develops a profound and almost sacred quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of extreme attention, of listening. When a U-boat is submerged and moving through waters where enemy vessels might patrol, silence becomes the primary survival mechanism. The diesel engines that powered the boat on the surface must be shut down, replaced by electric motors that hummed almost inaudibly beneath the sound of water flowing past the hull. No unnecessary footsteps, no voices above a whisper, no clattering of tools or dropping of objects. A single sound, carried through the water and picked up by enemy hydrophones, or the new sonar equipment the Allies were developing, could mean the difference between remaining unseen or being detected, hunted, and destroyed. Rösing established the protocols that would govern this silence, not through fear, but through reason, through an explanation given once, and then simply embodied in the routine. A commanding officer who commands through terror creates crews that break under pressure, that make mistakes born of panic rather than error. But a commander who explains the necessity of silence, who makes each man understand that his discipline protects not just himself, but the 49 others sharing his steel coffin, creates crews that maintain that silence almost without conscious effort. It becomes as natural as breathing, or more precisely, as the careful, measured breathing of men conserving oxygen in a sealed environment. The daily rhythms of U-48 under Rösing's command developed a particular texture, one that the crew would later describe in letters and memoirs with a kind of nostalgic precision. The boat would typically spend the night on the surface, running on diesel, charging batteries, while the lookouts scanned the horizon and the radio operator listened for coded messages from headquarters. The crew worked in watches, typically 4 hours on and 8 hours off, though this schedule was flexible depending on what the boat was hunting or what was hunting the boat. Below the surface, in daylight hours when enemy aircraft were most likely to be active, the watches became tighter, the atmosphere more compressed. Men would rest where they could, often in the torpedo compartment forward, lying on top of the long cylindrical shapes of the weapons themselves, covered by thin mattresses that never fully dried in the constant humidity. Food aboard was a strange mixture of abundance and monotony. The German submarine service supplied their boats with relatively good provisions compared to many navies. There was fresh bread at the start of a patrol, canned vegetables, meat in various preserved forms, butter, even chocolate and jam. But after a few weeks, the supplies began to exhaust themselves. The bread would mold, the butter would turn rancid in the damp and the warmth. What remained was canned fare, repetitive, and somehow both substantial and unsatisfying. The galley of a U-boat was scarcely larger than a closet, managed by the cook and his assistant, with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. A hot meal, prepared in those cramped conditions, distributed carefully through the boat's compartments, so that men on watch could eat while remaining at their stations, was as close to a luxury as submarine service offered. Do you wonder what it would have been like to spend weeks or months in such close quarters, knowing that discovery meant nearly certain death? The psychological adaptation required was substantial, and not all men could manage it. Some developed a claustrophobia that became almost unbearable, a pressing sensation that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Others found an unexpected peace in the routine, in the clarity of purpose that came from knowing that every action served a specific, immediate function. Rösing's command seemed to draw a particular quality of recruit, or perhaps his leadership brought that quality forward in men who might otherwise have been ordinary. The officers and the senior enlisted men who staffed U-48 under his command developed a reputation for professionalism, for the kind of calm competence that came from understanding not just what they were doing, but why it mattered and how their individual contributions fit into the larger mission. The command structure of a U-boat required a particular balance, something between the rigid hierarchy of a surface ship and the practical intimacy of a small group facing extreme danger together. Rösing was the captain, the commandant, and his authority was absolute in matters of survival and military operation. But below him, the senior petty officers and the chief engineer held a kind of quiet power that came from their technical knowledge and their experience. The chief engineer, the Leitender-Ingenieur, was a figure of particular importance, a man whose decisions about battery capacity, motor performance, and the delicate balance of buoyancy could mean the difference between an operational U-boat and one that sank helplessly toward crush depth. In U-48, Rösing worked closely with a small cadre of such men, individuals whose names would be remembered by the crew long after the war ended, whose technical decisions in moments of crisis prevented disasters that would otherwise have been fatal. The discipline of silence extended even to the management of human waste, a practical matter that modern sensibilities often overlook, but which submarines addressed with particular ingenuity and difficulty. The submarine had a single head, a toilet that could be flushed only when the boat was at a sufficient depth, and moving fast enough that the discharge would not create a betraying bubble trail that an alert enemy might spot. The toilets could not be flushed when the boat was submerged in shallow water or when stationary, waiting to ambush a convoy. This created a situation of profound human difficulty, managed through a kind of disciplined postponement and a careful rationing of use that became part of the unspoken code of submarine service. Men learned to control their bodies with the kind of determination that seems almost inhuman when considered from the comfort of the surface world. Water was precious, though not as precious as in some forms of military service. The U-boats carried supplies for drinking and cooking, and washing was possible but limited. The damp that accumulated on every surface, that you could see dripping from the walls and pooling on the deck, was not fresh water, but the condensation from human breath and perspiration collected by the cold metal hull. Men could wipe their faces with towels, but genuine bathing was impossible, a luxury that only returned when the boat reached its base. The smell that accumulated in a U-boat after weeks at sea was something that penetrated into the fabric, into hair and clothing, and the very skin, a particular combination of diesel fuel, human sweat, cooking food, moisture, and something else less definable, perhaps the scent of fear itself, or at least of human bodies compressed together in a sealed environment with no escape. Yet within this, Rösing cultivated something that might be called culture, or at least intentional humanity. On Sundays, when tactically possible, there would be a slightly improved meal, a recognition of a day different from the others. At Christmas, or on other significant dates in the calendar, some small observance would be made, a nod to the fact that these men were more than mere mechanical operators of a weapon system. The captain's table, the tiny wardroom where the officers took their meals and conducted their navigation planning, was a space of particular quiet importance. Here Rösing would sometimes share maps and explain the strategic thinking behind their current patrol, giving the officers a sense of how their immediate tactical situation connected to the larger picture. This kind of leadership, this willingness to explain, rather than simply command, created a particular atmosphere aboard U-48. The boat itself, considered as a machine, had particular characteristics that every crew member learned to read and respond to. Different sounds meant different things. The ping of enemy sonar, for instance, was not the only sound that could kill you. The groaning of the hull itself at depth, the strange musical notes that the pressure created in different compartments, the particular quality of sound that the electric motors made when they were pushing hard, the almost inaudible hum of the air purification system, trying to keep the atmosphere breathable. Each of these sounds told an experienced ear something about the boat's status, its speed, its depth, and its immediate condition. The sonar operator, sitting in his small compartment forward with his headset on, listening to the ocean, developed an almost sixth sense for the meaning of the water's whispers. Rösing himself was a listener in this sense, not merely a reader of instruments, but a man who understood his boat through sound and feeling as much as through the technical data. A captain of a submarine is constantly making decisions based on imperfect information, a distant sound detected by the hydrophones, a shadow that might be a ship or might be a whale. The grey expanse of the Atlantic in those early months of 1940 held a particular kind of tension for those who learned to read it, a stillness that could shatter at any moment into chaos, or else stretch into endless hours of nothing at all. When Rösing took command of U-48 in the winter of that year, the boat had already proven itself as more than a mere vessel. She was, in some way, becoming a legend before the full weight of legend had time to settle upon her. But legend, in those early patrols, was still being written in the actual log entries, in the coordinates of merchant vessels spotted on the horizon, in the precise calculations of depth and distance that meant the difference between a successful engagement and a desperate escape through darkness. The first patrols out of Kiel began with a kind of deliberate routine, almost a meditation on watchfulness. The crew would surface at dusk when the light still clung to the edge of the world in pale bands, scanning the horizon through the periscope with the patience of hunters who understood that their prey moved across an almost infinite ocean. Convoys were not always easy to find, despite what the intelligence reports promised. A merchant fleet might scatter across hundreds of square kilometers of water. The timing had to align perfectly. The correct sea state, the correct visibility, the correct position relative to the expected shipping lanes. And yet, there was also an element of sheer fortune in it. The kind of thing that separated an adequate commander from one who seemed to possess an almost uncanny gift for appearing in the right place at precisely the right moment. Under Rösing's command, U-48 developed a pattern that other captains began to notice, and in their own way, to study. He would position the boat not directly in the path of a convoy, but slightly ahead and to the side, waiting in the pattern of currents and temperature gradients that he had learned to read almost instinctively. When the merchant ships appeared, slow, laden with supplies or materials, moving in their defensive clusters, he would maneuver with a kind of unhurried precision that belied the intense calculations happening below in the torpedo room. The gunners and the engineers and the officers plotting fire control data were moving in coordinated silence, each man aware of the weight of what they were about to attempt. The mathematics of U-boat warfare in 1940 were, in many respects, quite elegant in their simplicity. A torpedo traveled at roughly 30 knots through the water. A merchant vessel might move at 10 or 12. The angle of approach, the depth setting, the deflection angle, these variables had to be solved before firing. Get them wrong, and the torpedo would pass harmlessly beyond its target, or worse, hit a ship that was not the intended victim. Get them right, and a vessel carrying hundreds of tons of supplies or fuel or troops would begin to sink. The British and the Norwegians and the French had all learned to accept this gamble, accepting that crossing the Atlantic meant accepting a certain probability of being sent to the bottom of the cold grey sea. By the middle of 1940, U-48 had already begun to accumulate a remarkable record. The numbers themselves, when one encounters them in naval records now, seem almost abstract. 17 ships sunk in those first several patrols, perhaps more, because the exact accounting depends on which sources one consults and what counts as a sinking versus a damaging versus a probable kill. But for the crews of those merchant vessels, the numbers were entirely concrete. Each sinking represented weeks of work, thousands of tons of supplies lost to the Atlantic depths, and in many cases, the deaths of men who had families waiting in Liverpool or Glasgow, or neutral ports where ship owners maintained their offices. The rhythm of a successful patrol developed its own peculiar texture. There would be days of searching with nothing to report, the boat rising and falling on the swell, the crew falling into the routines that filled the long hours underwater. Then, suddenly, a lookout would spot smoke on the horizon, and the entire boat would come alive with a particular kind of focused energy. The diving alarm would sound. The captain would move to the attack position. The voice would come through the speaking tubes, steady, analytical, giving the orders that would determine whether this particular engagement would end in success or in a hasty retreat beneath the waves to avoid the retaliatory depth charges that the escort vessels would begin dropping with increasing urgency and precision. What began to distinguish Rösing from many of his peers, according to those who served under him and those who studied the patrol reports afterward, was not merely the success rate itself, though that was certainly remarkable. It was rather the quality of the decision-making that seemed to govern each attack. He did not appear to take unnecessary risks. He did not, as some captains would later do, press an attack beyond the point where it remained tactically sound. Instead, there seemed to be a kind of mathematical coldness to his approach, as though he were solving equations rather than sending ships and men to their deaths, and perhaps that emotional distance was itself a kind of strength in this particular form of warfare, where sentiment had no place in the fire control center. By the autumn of 1940, After several productive patrols, U-48 had become something of a known quantity in the German naval establishment. The boat was being recognized as successful, and Rösing's name was being noted in the upper ranks of command as belonging to an officer who seemed to understand the mechanics of this new form of warfare with an almost intuitive grasp. The tonnage sunk was climbing, 30,000 tons, then 40,000 tons, perhaps more. The exact figures remain somewhat contested by historians, depending on whose accounting one accepts, and what post-war investigations concluded about which sinkings could be definitively attributed to which boat. But the general trajectory was unmistakable. U-48 was, by the standards of 1940 and early 1941, an extraordinarily successful vessel, and the quiet, methodical officer commanding her was beginning to acquire a reputation that extended beyond his own crew and into the wider community of U-boat commanders. Yet there was, perhaps, something worth noting about the nature of this success. Even in those early months when Germany still seemed poised to achieve a kind of dominance over the Atlantic, the convoys were still relatively poorly defended, the escort vessels were often scattered and inadequately equipped with the latest detection technology. The air cover did not yet extend far enough out into the mid-Atlantic to provide consistent protection. These were windows of advantage, and Rösing, like many of his fellow commanders, was navigating through those windows with considerable effectiveness. How long such conditions would persist remained, of course, an open question. The British were learning, developing new tactics, producing new ships and new detection equipment. But in 1940 and the first months of 1941, there remained a kind of hunting season quality to the U-boat war, and U-48, under Rösing's command, was a remarkably adept participant in that particular phase of the conflict. The stories that would later emerge from crew members who served aboard the boat during this period often focused on a particular quality of atmosphere that seemed to pervade the vessel during successful patrols. There was a kind of confidence there, not arrogance necessarily, but a sense that the men serving under Rösing believed themselves to be part of something that was working, that was effective, that represented the cutting edge of a new form of naval warfare. Whether such confidence was entirely justified by objective circumstances was perhaps less relevant than the fact that it existed, that the crew believed in their captain and in the boat, and that this belief manifested itself in the kinds of disciplined, coordinated actions that produced successful attacks against merchant convoys and, increasingly, against military vessels as well. The grey water around U-48 was never truly empty. Even on nights when the crew heard only the diesel thrum and the splash of waves against the hull, there existed an intricate geometry of danger and possibility that only a trained eye could read. And Rösing had learned to read it, as one might read the subtle shifts in a beloved landscape at twilight, each variation holding meaning, each shadow suggesting another presence somewhere in that vast, featureless expanse. What made U-48's success remarkable was not simply the tonnage sunk or the frequency of its patrols, but rather the system in which those sinkings occurred. The German Navy's submarine force had evolved a doctrine that transformed the ocean into something resembling a coordinated hunting ground, and to understand how Rösing thrived within it is to understand the delicate orchestration of modern underwater warfare. The wolf pack, as the Allies came to call it, or Rudeltaktik, in the precise German nomenclature, represented a fundamental shift in how submarines could be employed. No longer were they solitary hunters prowling the depths. Instead, they were coordinated units, often 5 or 6 or more, positioned along the anticipated route of a convoy, linked by radio signals and the careful plotting of movements that seemed almost like a chess game played across hundreds of miles. The concept had emerged gradually from necessity and experimentation. A single U-boat, even one commanded with Rösing's acuity, faced certain disadvantages when approaching a well-defended convoy. The escort vessels, the destroyers, the corvettes, the trawlers armed with depth charges, could track a submarine's approach and force it deep, away from its prey. But a coordinated attack, orchestrated from above by a flotilla commander with a clear picture of the developing situation, could overwhelm those defenses through sheer simultaneity of assault. When multiple U-boats attacked from different angles during the same hour of darkness, the escort commander faced an impossible calculus. How many threats? From which direction? Which target first? This required a particular kind of patience and discipline that ran counter to the temperament of many submarine captains. The order might come through the radio: maintain position, hold course, wait for the signal, and a commander like Rösing would have to resist the impulse to strike independently. There was a hierarchy to it, a recognition that individual glory sometimes had to yield to collective efficiency. The flotilla commander, positioned farther back with a broader view of the unfolding engagement, might see an opportunity that an individual captain could not. And so the submarine would cruise on the surface, silent except for the careful rotation of its diesel engines, watching, waiting, sometimes for hours. And when night came, true night, the kind without moon, when the sea became indistinguishable from the sky, that was when the surface attacks occurred. This was where U-boat warfare departed most dramatically from the popular imagination of submarines as exclusively underwater hunters. The boats would rise fully from the depths, their conning towers breaking water, their hulls almost completely exposed to air and spray. From this position, the submarine gun crews could work with surprising speed and efficiency. A shot from the 88mm deck gun, aimed at a cargo vessel or a slower escort, could cripple or sink a target far more economically than expending a precious torpedo. Ammunition was heavy, yes, but it was cheaper than a torpedo, and on long patrols into distant waters, the calculus of expenditure mattered. Rösing had overseen these surface engagements with meticulous attention. The gunnery officers on U-48 trained relentlessly, practicing the elevation and traverse of the deck gun until the motions became nearly automatic. In the chaos of a night surface attack, with the convoy scattering and the escorts wheeling toward the U-boat, there was no time for calculation or hesitation. The gun captain had to know, without thinking, how to traverse the gun platform, how to estimate range, how to adjust fire based on the fall of shot. The crew on deck, exposed to the cold and spray, had to work with the precision of men far below in protected spaces. And then, if the escort grew too dangerous, too close, the order would come: clear the bridge, dive, and those men had to scramble back below as the ballast tanks flooded and the boat slipped again beneath the surface, seeking the safety of depth. The actual mechanics of torpedo warfare, by contrast, operated within a different realm of calculation altogether. A torpedo, the electric models that powered many of U-48's most successful engagements, traveled through water at perhaps 30 knots, its trajectory dependent on speed, target course, distance, and an element of prediction about where the target would be, not where it currently was. The firing solutions that the U-boat's crew calculated, often working with a mechanical computer known as the TDC, or Torpedo Data Computer, had to account for the angle of the convoy's movement, the speed of the target vessel, the current if one could detect it, and the peculiar refraction of sound through different temperatures and densities of water. For Rösing's crew, these calculations occupied a strange psychological space. They were, in one sense, almost abstract, numbers and courses and degrees of bearing, but they represented the difference between a successful engagement and a wasted weapon, between a ship sinking and a ship sailing safely past. The firing order, when it came, was remarkably quiet, almost ceremonial in its formality. The torpedo left the tube with a soft release of compressed air, and then there was a period of perhaps 3 minutes, sometimes more, when the crew simply waited. They could sometimes hear the torpedo running through the hydrophone, a thin mechanical whine, and they could hear the drum of the target's propellers, growing closer or more distant, depending on the firing solution's accuracy. And then came either the muffled thump of a detonation, felt through the boat's hull as much as heard, or the silence that meant a miss, the return to the search, the necessity of maneuvering into position again. What made the Wolfpack tactics particularly effective when combined with these surface attacks and torpedo firings was the element of coordination in darkness. A single U-boat operating alone would attack once, perhaps twice, and then flee the scene before the escort could counterattack effectively. But a wolf pack attack, properly coordinated, meant successive waves of assault. As one boat dived to escape an escort's counterattack, another would be moving into surface attack position. While the defenders were occupied with the first threat, the second would strike. The coordination required radio communication, careful positioning during daylight hours when the wolf pack had to remain hidden from aircraft, and the kind of discipline that only came from training and repetition and trust in the flotilla commander's judgment. Rösing absorbed all of this, not merely as technical knowledge, but as a lived experience, accumulated through months of patrols in the Atlantic darkness. Every firing solution, every surface attack, every coordinated engagement with other U-boats taught him something about the rhythm of the hunt, about the psychology of escorts and convoys, about the moment when caution should yield to aggression, and the moment when aggression had to retreat into stealth. To truly understand the life of a U-boat commander, one must first descend into the metal world he inhabited, where the ordinary rhythms of human existence became something altogether strange and compressed. A submarine at operational depth was not merely a workplace or a vessel. It was, for weeks or months at a time, a complete universe unto itself, with its own atmosphere, its own silence, its own particular weight pressing down from above. The air inside a U-boat grew thick, with a peculiar quality that no surface dweller could quite prepare for. Diesel fuel was the first and most persistent scent, its acrid tang settling into clothing, into skin, into the very fibers of a man's being, until he ceased to notice it consciously, yet it remained a constant beneath every other odor in the boat. Mixed with that fuel smoke came the salt from the ocean that seeped through seals and fittings, and then, as weeks accumulated, the unmistakable human smell of men living in quarters, so confined that personal space became almost an abstract concept. There was no escaping any odor, no corner of a submarine where a man could step away from the accumulated breath and sweat and waste of his fellow crew members. The air was recycled constantly through the boat's ventilation system, which meant that what one man smelled, all men came to smell, and after a time, a peculiar olfactory numbness set in, as if the nose itself accepted the terms of underwater existence and surrendered its protestations. The physical space that Rösing and his crew shared aboard U-48 was almost incomprehensibly small. The boat itself measured roughly 120 meters in length, but this length was divided into compartments, and each compartment was engineered for function rather than comfort. The control room, where critical operations took place, was perhaps the most claustrophobic space of all, a nexus of gauges, wheels, levers, and speaking tubes, where multiple men worked within arm's reach of one another, sometimes close enough that when one man breathed deeply, the next man felt the shift of air between them. Sleeping spaces, or what passed for them, were often bunks stacked 3 high, with perhaps 18 inches of clearance above each bunk, where a man lay, with his face nearly touching the cold metal of the compartment above. Some crew members didn't have permanent sleeping places at all. They shared bunks in rotation with men on different watch schedules, meaning that a bunk might never cool between occupants, and a man would lie down in a space still warm from another's body. The galley, small though it was, became a kind of social center precisely because it offered one of the few slightly larger spaces where men could gather. Food aboard U-boats was a subject of considerable thought and some pride. The crew ate better, in many respects, than soldiers ashore endured. There were fresh provisions early in a patrol, meat, fresh vegetables, bread baked in the boat's tiny oven, and the petty officer in charge of supplies took pains to prepare meals that offered some variation and small comfort. But as weeks at sea accumulated, the fresh stores depleted, and the menu shifted toward preserved goods, canned vegetables, and salt meat. The smell of cooking permeated the boat even more intensely than diesel, and for men living in perpetual semi-hunger, the scent of meat stewing could become almost unbearably present. The lavatory arrangements deserved their own contemplation. A submarine carried perhaps 45 men in a space where normal human functions had to occur in extraordinary circumstances. The head, or lavatory, was a small compartment with a toilet that operated under tremendous complexity when the boat was submerged. Flushing required precise procedural knowledge. Too hasty, and backflow could occur. Too slow, and discomfort accumulated for men waiting outside. The lavatory became a place of unexpected privacy in a world otherwise entirely communal, but it was a privacy purchased at the price of speed and the constant awareness that others waited beyond a thin metal door. Water aboard was precious. Drinking water and water for minimal washing had to be carefully rationed, particularly when the boat had been at sea for many weeks and distillation systems worked at reduced capacity. Personal cleanliness became something of a luxury, negotiated in small quantities. Men washed when the boat surfaced briefly at night, rinsing with salt water whenever possible to preserve fresh supplies. But many days passed in the depths when a man's last wash receded into the past by increments of days. The accumulation of this minor discomfort became, over weeks, something more profound, a slow erosion of the civilized habits that men clung to as tokens of their former lives above water. Silence. The silence of U-boat operations was perhaps the most pervasive and psychologically demanding aspect of life beneath the waves. When the boat submerged for active patrol, unnecessary noise became genuinely dangerous. A careless footstep, a valve opened too quickly, a tool dropped on metal. Any of these could register in an enemy's listening gear, could betray position to destroyer escorts, or to passing aircraft that had dropped into the water to hunt. Commanders instilled discipline around silence with extraordinary attention. Men learned to move with deliberation, to think before they acted, to communicate sometimes with only hand signals and whispered words. The quiet stretched through hours of waiting, broken suddenly by alarms and the controlled urgency of action, then settling back into profound quiet once more. This silence pressed on men in ways that surface combat never quite demanded. In the darkness and stillness of a submerged boat, with only the occasional creak of hull metal expanding or contracting under pressure, with the distant hum of electric motors and the soft whoosh of ventilation, a man confronted both the vast emptiness surrounding his vessel and the intense proximity of his comrades. Some men found this combination meditative, even peaceful, a kind of enforced mindfulness where the mind, having little external stimulus, could turn inward. Others struggled against what they experienced as imprisonment, fighting an internal battle against claustrophobia and the primal anxiety that came from being sealed inside a metal tube tens of meters below the surface, knowing that a single catastrophic failure would bring the entire ocean rushing in to obliterate everything. The crew of U-48, under Rösing's command, developed a particular quality of cohesion born directly from these extreme conditions. Men who lived this way together, who shared the constant low-level fear and discomfort, who learned to trust their shipmates literally with their lives, formed bonds that were almost family-like in their depth. Rösing, as commander, set the tone for how this pressure was managed. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that the psychological well-being of his men was inseparable from the boat's operational success. A crew that was fractured or fearful would make mistakes. A crew that was held together by something more than mere hierarchy and discipline. A crew that believed in its commander and in its own collective competence could function with precision even under the most demanding circumstances. The watches that structured each day at sea followed rhythms that had nothing to do with sun or moon, which were invisible in any case. In the depths, time became abstract, marked only by the switching of watches every 4 hours, each watch bringing new faces to the control room, new hands on the throttle and the diving planes. A man might stand watch for 4 hours, then rest for 8, or work some other rotation, depending on his specialty and the boat's current operational tempo. Sleep came in fragments, in whatever rest could be captured in a bunk, surrounded by noise and the constant vibration of engines and ventilation machinery. The cumulative exhaustion of weeks underwater created a state that was neither quite asleep nor truly awake, and men learned to function in this twilight condition with a kind of disciplined automatism. Peculiar rituals developed in this compressed world. Men crafted small personal spaces within their bunks, pinning photographs or drawings to the metal walls, creating tiny shrines to the lives they had left behind. They exchanged letters and messages in written form even aboard the boat, written notes that sometimes never left the submarine, that were simply acknowledgements of presence and connection in the midst of isolation. Some men kept diaries, though this was technically prohibited by military regulations, a small rebellion against the absolute control that submarine command required. These diaries became repositories for the small moments that structured existence: a particularly good meal, a letter received during the brief periods when mail could reach the boat, a moment of fear, a moment of strange humor in the face of danger. The sounds of U-boat operation created their own subcategory of lived experience. The ping of sonar, an enemy's active sonar searching the water for a submarine, was perhaps the most anxiety-inducing sound a crew could hear. It reverberated through the boat with an insistent, almost accusatory quality, and every man aboard knew that if those pings grew more frequent or more intense, they might be facing their final moments. The whoosh and vibration of torpedo tubes being loaded, the distinct mechanical sound of each system being brought to operational readiness, the sudden roar of the diesel engines when the boat surfaced at night to run on the surface and charge its batteries. These sounds were so intimately bound to the rhythms of survival that they became almost comforting in their familiarity. A sound meant something. It conveyed information. It told a crew member where they were in the patrol cycle. And then there was the moment when danger passed, when a convoy escaped or a hunter-killer was outmaneuvered, when the boat could slow and settle into the quiet business of endurance once more. In those moments, if a crew could sleep, they slept. If they could eat, they ate. Men might sit quietly for hours, occupying whatever small space they had claimed, thinking thoughts they kept mostly to themselves, or talking in low voices about home, about what they would do when the patrol ended, about small details of their previous lives that seemed to grow less and less real with each passing day underwater. This was the human world that shaped Rösing as a commander and as a man, not the grand strategic calculations or the tactical maneuvers that would fill history books, but the dense, immediate reality of how men survived in an environment fundamentally hostile to human existence, and how a single officer could either preserve his crew's humanity or allow it to erode under the weight of circumstance and fear. By the time U-48 had completed her 5th and 6th patrols in late 1940 and into 1941, something subtle but unmistakable had begun to shift in the whispered conversations of the U-boat commanders. They spoke of Rösing differently now, not with the casual respect afforded to any officer who brought his boat home with tonnage credited to the Kriegsmarine, but with something closer to recognition. He had moved beyond the ordinary run of competent captains. The statistics of his patrol record had become almost quietly legendary in the confined world of the submarine bases, a small, tight-knit community where every sinking was known, every loss was mourned, and every captain's tactics were studied with the intensity of men who understood that tomorrow it might be their own boat descending into the depths. What made Rösing's reputation different, though, was less about the sheer numbers he had sent to the bottom, though those numbers were certainly substantial, placing him among the more successful commanders of the early war years, and more about the way he seemed to approach his work with a kind of methodical precision, a deliberate thoughtfulness that distinguished him from some of the more aggressive or reckless captains. He did not take unnecessary risks. He did not surface rashly or attack when the tactical advantage was not clearly in his favor, and yet, somehow, this caution did not translate into hesitation. Instead, it seemed to sharpen his success, to make his victories feel earned rather than lucky. In the confined officers' clubs of the U-boat arm, in the quiet evenings when men gathered to discuss their patrols and share the weight of command, Rösing found himself in conversation with some of the men who were themselves beginning to make their own marks on the war. These were younger captains, often less experienced than Rösing himself, but burning with the kind of intensity and hunger that marks the rising stars of any military service. Among them was a man named Günther Prien, already celebrated for his audacious raid into Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, where he had penetrated the heart of the British fleet's sanctuary and sunk the battleship Royal Oak in waters that were supposed to be impregnable. Prien carried with him the aura of a man who had already achieved the kind of legendary status that most commanders could only dream of, and yet he was approachable, thoughtful, willing to listen to peers. There was also Otto Kretschmer, a man whose name would eventually come to be spoken with reverence throughout the U-boat service, a captain who seemed to possess an almost intuitive understanding of convoy warfare, who could read the patterns of merchant ships and their escorts with the fluency of someone reading a familiar text. Kretschmer was quieter than Prien, more introspective perhaps, but no less formidable in his own way. When he walked into a room, other officers took notice. And it was in these circles, in these conversations that ranged across tactics and technical matters and the deeper philosophy of submarine warfare, that Rösing began to form the kind of professional friendships that would shape the trajectory of his own career, and in some ways, the shape of the entire U-boat campaign itself. What is perhaps remarkable about these relationships, though it is also, in its way, quite natural, is that they seem to be built not on competition, but on mutual respect and a shared understanding that the submarine service required a particular kind of intelligence, a particular kind of courage, and a particular kind of discipline. These men were not rivals in any petty sense. They were colleagues in an extraordinarily dangerous profession, and that shared danger seemed to create a bond that transcended the ordinary hierarchies of military rank. Rösing, though somewhat older than some of these rising stars, was never positioned as an elder statesman condescending to the younger generation. Rather, he seemed to move among them as a peer, a fellow traveller in a shared struggle. The conversations that occurred in these settings were often technical in nature, discussions of the best approach angles for attacking convoys at night on the surface, the advantages and disadvantages of various attack profiles, the ways in which the British and American escort tactics were evolving, and how German U-boat commanders might adapt in response. But there was also something deeper running through these exchanges, a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that they were all involved in something historically significant, something that would be remembered and studied long after the war itself had ended. There was a sense, perhaps, that they were all acutely aware they were living through a moment that would define them, and that the choices they made and the techniques they developed would have repercussions that extended far beyond their individual boats and individual patrols. The U-boat arm in 1940 and 1941, before the tide of the war had truly turned against Germany, carried within it a particular kind of confidence and optimism. The Atlantic seemed vast, and the possibilities seemed nearly limitless. The convoy system, for all its sophistication, still seemed penetrable. British defences, while improving, were not yet the overwhelming force they would become, and among the commanders who populated the service, there was a sense that they were part of an elite, a vanguard of a new kind of warfare that Germany had pioneered and perfected. Within this world, Rösing was beginning to occupy a special place, not necessarily the most celebrated, perhaps not even the most aggressive, but respected for his judgment, admired for his success, and sought out by younger officers who understood that his experience and his thoughtfulness might offer lessons that could keep them alive. It is worth pausing here to consider what this period must have felt like from the inside, from the perspective of men who did not yet know how the war would end, who did not yet understand that the Atlantic would eventually become a graveyard of German submarines and German hopes. They were experiencing, in real time, what appeared to be a series of victories, an unfolding campaign that seemed to be going according to plan. The losses were mounting. Every commander knew men who did not come home, whose boats were lost to the British defences that were becoming steadily more effective, but these losses seemed acceptable within the larger framework of what appeared to be a winning strategy. And in this atmosphere of emergent success and growing reputation, Rösing found himself at the center of a network of friendships and professional relationships that would, in many ways, define the rest of his career. For even as he continued to command U-48, even as he added to his patrol record and his tonnage sunk, something else was beginning to happen. There were whispers, hints that he might be considered for a different kind of role, a different kind of responsibility. The U-boat arm was growing, rapidly and substantially. There were new boats, new crews, new captains coming into service constantly. And the question that seemed to hover in the background, in the quiet thoughts of the senior commanders and the admirals who oversaw the submarine service, was whether men like Rösing, men of demonstrated skill and sound judgment, might be better employed not just in command of individual boats, but in shaping the entire future direction of the service itself. It was not a sudden thing, this shift in Rösing's purpose. The sea does not announce its changes with fanfare. They arrive like the slow turning of a tide, felt more than seen, a gradual reorientation that goes unnoticed, until one day you realize you are facing an entirely different horizon. By 1941, 2 years into the war, the mathematics of the U-boat offensive were beginning to reveal themselves in their true complexity. The early months had belonged to Germany. The merchant tonnage sunk had seemed almost limitless, the convoys vulnerable, the defensive measures of the Allies fumbling and improvised. But even in that time of apparent advantage, something was shifting in the calculations of the Oberkommando der Marine. It was becoming clear that the U-boat war would not be won by individual aces, no matter how skilled their commanders, no matter how unerring their aim. What was needed instead was a constant stream of new boats, new crews, officers who understood not just how to kill, but how to train others to kill with discipline and precision. Rösing's record on U-48 had not gone unnoticed in the corridors of command. By the standards of those early years, his vessel had proven itself among the most reliable in the fleet. Not the most celebrated, perhaps. There were other captains whose names had begun to enter the realm of legend. Men who would sink more tonnage, whose success would echo more loudly through history. But Rösing possessed something rarer than a single spectacular patrol or an extraordinary run of luck. He possessed consistency. He possessed the kind of mind that learned from each engagement, that understood the choreography of pursuit and attack in ways that went beyond instinct or aggression. He knew how to keep a crew functioning in the grinding, suffocating pressure of weeks beneath the surface. He understood that in the submarine war, it was not the moment of the kill that determined victory, but the 1,000 small moments of discipline that led a boat and its men safely back to port. It was this quality, perhaps, that made him valuable in a way that the Admiralty recognized, even if the propagandists did not. There were officers aplenty who could command a submarine to its target, but how many could teach others? How many possessed not just the ability to survive the depths, but the clarity of mind to articulate what survival meant, to shape the instincts and reactions of younger men who had never heard a depth charge thunder through the hull? In the spring of 1942, word came down that Rösing was to be transferred. The specific reasons were never entirely clear. Such things rarely were in the German military hierarchy. Was it a recognition of his gifts as an instructor? Or was there, perhaps, a hint of something else? A sense that his luck might not hold forever, that the sea, which had been merciful to him, might eventually demand the same price from him that it had already exacted from so many others? Or did someone, somewhere, simply recognize that a man with his particular talents might serve Germany better on land, in the training establishments and administrative offices that kept the U-boat fleet functioning? Whatever the calculus, the outcome was clear. Rösing was offered a new position, one that would take him away from the Atlantic and the immediate dangers of submarine command. He would leave U-48, leave the rhythm of patrols and hunts, leave the singular focus of hunting convoys in the grey wastes of the ocean. The transition could not have been easy. A submarine commander who leaves his boat is, in some measure, leaving behind a part of himself, the identity forged in the particular pressures and intimacies of a vessel and its crew, the strange fraternity of men who have lived together in darkness and danger. But there was something else too, something that perhaps only a certain kind of officer could have seen or understood. If the U-boat war was to be fought not just in the present, but into an indefinite future, then the cultivation of future commanders became not merely important, but essential. The war had already consumed countless experienced sailors, men who had learned their craft in the previous conflict or in the early years of this one. Their knowledge was irreplaceable, yet it could not simply be preserved like a museum piece. It had to be transmitted, taught, embedded in the consciousness of the next generation of officers who would take command of the boats coming off the ways, the young men who would be expected to operate with the same skill and discipline that the war had already demanded. And so Hans-Rudolf Rösing made a choice, whether entirely willingly or not, to become a teacher. He would step out of the spotlight, away from the individual achievements that war had offered him, away from the possibility of becoming one of the legendary names that would be spoken of in hushed tones in naval circles after the conflict had ended. Instead, he would work in the shadows of the training establishment, shaping the minds of other men, building the foundation upon which their future successes, or failures, would rest. The sea did not release him entirely, of course. A man who has spent years learning its moods and deceptions does not simply forget, but his relationship to it would change. Where once he had been its hunter, he would now be its teacher, explaining its dangers to those who had never felt the lurch of a boat diving beneath the surface, or heard the particular silence that comes when you are sitting in absolute darkness, miles beneath the waves, hoping that no one above has marked your position with death. Yet there comes a moment in the life of certain men, those whose minds have been shaped by years of command beneath the surface, when the institution that formed them calls upon their accumulated knowledge in a different way. For Hans-Rudolf Rösing, this transition arrived not as a demotion, though some might have perceived it so, but rather as a recognition that his particular gift, the ability to read danger, to sense weakness in an adversary's patterns, to nurture the instinct for survival in younger officers, was needed elsewhere. The machinery of the U-boat arm was hungry, endlessly hungry, and it consumed men with a velocity that no peacetime academy could hope to replenish. By the autumn of 1942, Rösing received his appointment as Führer der Unterseeboote West, a title that placed him in command of all U-boat operations and administration from the French Atlantic coast. This was not merely a bureaucratic shuffling, this was an acknowledgement that the war at sea had entered a new phase, one where raw aggression must be tempered by strategic thinking, where the flow of trained crews and properly prepared vessels would determine whether Germany's submarine force could sustain itself against the gathering storm of Allied countermeasures. The bases he would oversee, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Brest, were no longer the quiet harbours of peacetime drills. They had become fortress ports, bristling with anti-aircraft batteries, ringed with concrete bunkers, places where the constant rumble of construction mingled with the smell of diesel fuel and salt spray. From his headquarters, Rösing looked out across a transformation that would have seemed incomprehensible mere years before. What had been French coastal towns were now German military complexes, the entire western seaboard of occupied France converted into a launching platform for a war machine. The U-boats that crowded these harbours, sleek, grey, somehow both lethal and fragile in appearance, represented an investment of resources, raw materials, and human ingenuity that Germany could ill afford to squander. And squander them they had been doing, in the relentless calculus of attrition that defined the Atlantic campaign. For every U-boat that returned victorious, another lay somewhere in the dark, its hull crushed by depth charges, its crew lost to the cold that permeates even in sleep. Rösing's role was to change this mathematics, or at least to slow its degradation. He stood at a peculiar nexus between the demands of Berlin, where Dönitz and his staff demanded ever greater tonnage, sunk and ever longer operational ranges, between the captains returning from patrol, exhausted and diminished in number, and between the steady stream of young men, many barely in their 20s, who arrived at these bases with the expectation that they would somehow be ready to take a submarine into the teeth of Allied defenses. How does one prepare a human being for that impossible task? How does one instill both the aggression and the caution necessary to survive? These questions became the texture of Rösing's days, and they shaped every decision he made. The bases themselves were monuments to a certain kind of engineering ambition mixed with desperation. The concrete U-boat pens, those massive structures with roofs many meters thick, designed to withstand bombing, represented an enormous commitment of labor and material. Yet there was something almost poignant about them in retrospect. They were built on the assumption that the resources to construct them would remain available, that the war would continue in its current form long enough for the investment to pay dividends. But even as Rösing assumed his post, the very foundations of that assumption were beginning to crack. The tide of the war, though many did not yet wish to acknowledge it, was turning. But in the immediate present, in those months of late 1942 and into 1943, there was still a perceptible sense that the U-boat arm might yet achieve something transformative. The German submarine force remained, in many ways, a young man's service. Most of the captains were in their late 20s or early 30s. Most of the crews had only a few years of service. There was an esprit de corps, a sense of belonging to an elite, or at least to something exclusive and dangerous, that bound these men together. Rösing understood this psychology intimately. He had lived within it, had breathed it in the diesel fumes and the compressed air of a submarine's interior. He knew that no amount of equipment or tactical doctrine could substitute for the human element, the captain's nerve, the crew's trust in their commanding officer, the collective will to survive. His duties, therefore, encompassed far more than the simple logistics of supply and maintenance, though those were certainly part of the equation. They encompassed the selection of captains for new commissions, the allocation of the most experienced officers to the most promising vessels, the subtle art of understanding which men could be developed into leaders and which would need to be deployed differently. He reviewed patrol reports with an attention to detail that went beyond statistics. What had the captain chosen to report? What had he omitted? What did the pattern of tonnage sunk tell him about the captain's decision-making under pressure? Every report was a window into a mind under stress, and Rösing had learned to read these windows with great precision. The French bases operated with a peculiar rhythm that reflected their status as conquered territory. The French population, reduced and subjugated, provided much of the manual labor, but also watched with a kind of sullen resentment as German vessels departed and, more often than not, failed to return. Some of the support personnel, the engineers, the supply officers, the mechanics, were German, shipped in from the homeland to ensure reliability. Others were Frenchmen, who had made a pragmatic accommodation with the occupation, though what they truly thought remained opaque, buried beneath the necessities of survival. Rösing moved among all of this with a professional detachment, focusing on the narrow band of responsibility that defined his position, but he was aware, in the way that perceptive men are aware, that the entire structure rested on premises that might not hold indefinitely. The submarines themselves, by this point in the war, were undergoing a transformation. The Type Vic U-boats that had formed the backbone of the force in the earlier years remained the standard, but there was now an urgent push to develop and deploy new types, larger boats with greater endurance, boats designed to strike deeper, boats equipped with new technologies that might somehow counter the growing sophistication of Allied detection methods. Rösing would have been privy to these discussions, would have understood, at least to some degree, the technical arguments about tonnage, diesel capacity, torpedo load, and crew comfort. None of it, ultimately, could overcome a fundamental strategic problem, that Germany could build U-boats, but it could not build them faster than the Allies could sink them or counter them. The mathematics of attrition worked against innovation when your opponent had greater industrial capacity and resolve. Yet in this context, perhaps the truest value that Rösing could provide was human. The system needed officers who understood not just the technical demands of submarine command, but the psychological and spiritual dimensions as well. A submarine captain operating in the Atlantic in 1943 was operating under pressure unlike almost any other military role. His decisions determined not only his own fate, but that of every man in his boat, typically around 50 souls in a tight fic. The isolation was profound. Radio contact with base was intermittent and dangerous. Once a boat slipped beneath the surface, the captain and his crew existed in a kind of psychological remove from the rest of the world, utterly dependent on themselves and on the technological apparatus that surrounded them. And always, there was the knowledge that death was not abstract, but specific and potentially imminent. Did you think about this when you heard the first distant rumble of approaching depth charges? Did you think about it when you felt the boat shudder from a near miss? Or did your mind, through some mechanism of self-preservation, retreat into pure function, into the next decision, the next order, the next moment? Rösing's role in training and selection was partly about identifying the men who possessed some elusive quality of resilience, not fearlessness, for that was actually dangerous, but rather the ability to compartmentalize fear, to think clearly under duress, to command the respect and obedience of men who looked to him as their final insurance against the dark. How does one assess such qualities? How does one, in interview and observation, separate the genuinely capable from those who merely project confidence? Perhaps Rösing had no better answer to this than any other commander, but his years beneath the surface gave him a different baseline for judgment. He had lived through it himself. He had felt the pressure waves, had heard the sounds of the ocean pushing against the hull, had navigated the razor's edge between aggression and caution. That lived experience informed his selection of captains in ways that no amount of theoretical training could have achieved. The bases themselves, as centers of administration and training, took on a character that reflected Rösing's influence. There would have been classrooms and briefing rooms where young officers studied charts and attack protocols. There would have been practice simulations, drills conducted in harbor and in controlled exercises. There would have been the endless cycle of maintenance and repair, ships in dry dock being refitted, equipment being tested, the mechanical rhythm that kept the machinery of war functioning. And over it all, presiding with quiet authority, was Rösing himself, a man who had moved from the hunter to the shepherd, from the point of the spear to the forge where it was being shaped and reforged. The tension between these roles, the man of action and the man of administration, must have created within him a certain quietness, a contemplative quality that no doubt puzzled those who knew him less well. What separates the commander who sinks ships from the mentor who builds the commanders who sink them? It is a question that rarely occurred to the young officers who arrived at the training bases of occupied France, yet it sat at the very heart of Rösing's new calling. Having stepped away from the bridge of U-48, from the weight of periscope decisions and the thunder of torpedoes striking home, he found himself confronted with something more complex, more patient, and in its way, more consequential than any single patrol. He was to become the architect of capability, the man who would stand at the threshold between raw ambition and lethal competence. The training doctrine that Rösing inherited was already established in its broad outlines. The Reich had learned through blood and loss that submarine warfare could not be left to intuition, that the marriage of machinery, mathematics, and human nerve required a systematic cultivation. But what Rösing brought to Lorient, to Saint-Nazaire, to the other concrete bastions that housed the growing U-boat fleet, was something subtler than routine. He possessed the peculiar gift of a man who had lived the thing he was now tasked with teaching. He knew not merely the technical sequence of an attack, the calculations of bearing, the temporal geometry of intercept courses, the physics of compression as you drove deeper into the Atlantic's throat, but the feeling of command when every decision carried the possibility of death for yourself and for 40 other men suspended in a steel tube 200 meters below the surface. The young captains in training who reported to him were themselves survivors of a different sort of schooling. They had come through the Marineschule, the Naval Academy, where they had learned seamanship, history, and the traditions that supposedly distinguished the German officer corps from mere technicians. But the academy could not teach them the specific vertigo of command, the particular loneliness of knowing that your judgment, your nerve, your ability to interpret shadow and current, and the shape of the horizon, would determine whether your crew returned to their wives and children, or whether they would rest instead on the bed of the Atlantic, in waters so cold and so dark that such distinctions ceased to matter. Rösing understood that these young men arrived at his door, carrying this knowledge in their chest, like an unexploded charge. His method, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the fragments that remain, was grounded in a kind of ruthless realism. He did not lavish praise, nor did he traffic in the grand mythology that Nazi propagandists had woven around the U-boat service. Instead, he created a simulation of the hunt itself. In the classroom, on the tactical board, in the cramped mock-ups of submarine control rooms, he orchestrated scenarios. He would play the role of the enemy, commanding the Allied convoy, and he would watch with an intensity that made even experienced officers uneasy as his students attempted to solve the problem that had become more and more intractable as the years of war accumulated: how to approach, how to position, how to strike when the hunter was increasingly hunted. The scenarios themselves were not exercises in abstract mathematics, though mathematics was woven through them. Rather, they were narratives of choice. Rösing would present a situation, drawing on his own experience and on the reports of other commanders, and would ask his officers, "What do you do now?" The depth charge explosions from the escort, growing closer with each moment of delay. Do you descend and risk the increased pressure, the creaking of the hull, the growing certainty that if they hear you, if they lock onto your acoustic signature, they have you? Or do you maintain your depth, gambling that they are firing blind, that the darkness and vastness of the ocean will still shelter you, even as your own nerves scream that shelter cannot last forever? There were no correct answers, only better or worse answers, and Rösing had the authority of experience to show which choices led to patrol reports filed by other officers, and which led to gaps in the roster, to the families who received the formal letters of regret that marked a submarine lost with all hands. What made his instruction particular, what gave it the weight that seemed to haunt the memory of those who received it, was his insistence on the marriage between technical precision and human judgment. He would spend hours, it is said, discussing the behavior of convoy captains, the psychology of fear that governed Allied crews, the patterns of evasion that repeated across the Atlantic's vastness like the waves themselves. He taught his officers to think as hunters, to understand that the sea was not merely a medium through which you moved, but a landscape of intelligence, a realm where you must read not only the instruments before you, but the intentions of invisible adversaries and the thousand small signs that spoke of danger or opportunity. There was in Rösing's teaching a certain melancholy recognition, though it remained unspoken in any formal way. By the time he had assumed his training role, the context of the war had shifted irrevocably. The early years, when the U-boats had hunted almost at leisure in the shipping lanes, when a captain with nerve and skill could achieve the kind of tonnage figures that made him a legend in the Reich, those years had passed beyond recall. The Atlantic was becoming more lethal each month, not less. The Allies had learned to read German codes, to deploy more escorts, to arm them with weapons that were growing steadily more sophisticated. The radar sets mounted on Allied aircraft were becoming more numerous, more reliable, and they saw submarines from the air in ways that no surface ship could manage. A captain trained by Rösing in 1943 or 1944 was being prepared not for triumph, but for survival. He was being taught the refined skills that might allow him to complete one patrol, then perhaps another, before the odds finally closed in. Did Rösing articulate this darker arithmetic to his students? The historical record does not say clearly, though one can infer from the nature of his emphasis that he did not hide it. What would be the point of illusion at such a moment? Better to teach them with absolute clarity what they were being sent toward. Better to prepare them, not with false confidence, but with the hard competence that might, in some cases, extend their lives by days or weeks. His training doctrine thus became, in a sense, a kind of mercy. Not the mercy of false hope, but the mercy of genuine preparation, of knowing that when the depth charges fell and the hull groaned under the pressure, they would have been taught well enough to understand their options, to make the choices that seasoned judgment suggested were most likely to see them through. The captains who passed through Rösing's tutelage carried with them something indefinable, a quality that was noted by their peers and by the men who served under them. It was not merely competence, though competence was certainly part of it. It was a kind of sobriety, a recognition that the sea demanded respect and that the business of hunting in the depths was both more complex and more fragile than the propaganda suggested. In the pauses between patrols, in the moments when crews gathered in the concrete fortresses of their bases and spoke of the men they had known who did not return, there was a sense that Rösing's hand was visible in the choices that had kept certain commanders alive, that his teaching had become a thin thread of continuity, connecting them to something larger than their own individual fates. This is perhaps the quietest form of influence a man can exercise, not through direct command, but through the transmission of understanding, through the patient cultivation of judgment in others, through the building of a tradition of care within a system devoted to destruction. Among the young commanders who came through Rösing's purview in those middle years of the war, several would later be remembered as titans of U-boat warfare, their names appearing in the careful records that historians would pore over decades afterward. These men carried forward not merely his tactical knowledge, but something quieter, a philosophy of command that blended technical precision with an almost philosophical acceptance of the dangers they faced. To understand Rösing's true legacy requires sitting in the company of these officers, to see how his influence shaped not just their kills, but their character as captains beneath the waves. Consider Reinhard Suren, a man whose name would become synonymous with U-boat daring in the Atlantic. Suren passed through the training apparatus that Rösing had systematized, absorbing the methodical approach to convoy analysis that Rösing had perfected during his own years commanding U-48. The young captain brought intensity and a certain youthful aggression to his patrols, yet his operational choices bore the stamp of Rösing's influence, not recklessness disguised as courage, but calculated risks, grounded in deep knowledge of weather patterns, Allied escort procedures, and the geometry of attack. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant for the men aboard. A captain trained in Rösing's school would be one who had internalized the weight of every decision, who understood that bravery and competence were inseparable, and that the margin between success and catastrophic loss could be measured in minutes, sometimes in seconds. Another figure emerges from this shadow roster, Helmut Mansek, whose career demonstrated that Rösing's teaching extended even to officers who possessed greater native caution than some of their peers. Where Suren embodied a certain restless hunger for action, Mansek represented a different archetype, the thinking officer who preferred stealth to fury, who would sit beneath a convoy for hours in silence, waiting for the precise moment when the mathematics of position and tide and moonlight aligned. Had Mansek come of age without Rösing's influence, one might imagine him as merely competent. Instead, under that tutelage, he became something more, a man who could teach his crew not to fear silence, who could make them understand that patience beneath the waves was not cowardice, but a form of profound aggression, an aggression of intellect rather than impulse. The record also holds the name Dudley Morton's German counterpart in method, if not in personality, Eberhard Gott, who worked closely with Rösing in the administrative years and seemed to embody a curious synthesis of his mentor's practical realism and something almost romantic in his attachment to the U-boat arms traditions and codes. There remains a question, unresolved by historians, about how much of Gott's later strategic thinking about wolfpack coordination was born in conversations with Rösing, in those rare moments when the pressure of daily operations lifted enough for two experienced officers to discuss not just what had been sunk, but why and what it meant. We cannot know with certainty, yet the texture of Gott's later writings on U-boat tactics suggests a mind that had internalized Rösing's fundamental principle, that undersea warfare was not a matter of blind luck or Nazi ideology, but of applied knowledge, pursued with professional rigor. Yet the influence operated not only through the high-achieving aces, but through the ordinary competent captains who survived their patrols and returned to base with intact crews and moderate scores. These officers, whose names appear in registers and casualty lists but rarely in memoirs or histories written by the victors, carried Rösing's real gift, the knowledge that they could be methodical, careful, and still effective. They understood that the average German U-boat captain of 1943 or 1944 could not hope to repeat the spectacular triumphs of the early war years, when merchant convoys were poorly defended and the Atlantic was still, in some sense, a frontier. Instead, the officers trained under Rösing's watch were prepared for a war that had become steadily more difficult, more technologically contested, more dangerous. They knew how to preserve their boats and men against improving odds, how to take calculated risks without gambling with lives unnecessarily, how to withdraw and survive to patrol again. There is something almost poignant in recognizing this pattern. The aces themselves, Suren, Mansek, and their peers, would be remembered, written about, immortalized in the collective memory of the war at sea. But the training doctrine that Rösing had quietly assembled became so thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of U-boat operations that it eventually became invisible. Young captains would learn their lessons and apply them without always knowing the precise origin of a particular tactic or philosophy. They would sit in classrooms in occupied France or receive instruction aboard training vessels, and the ideas flowing through their minds had been shaped, refined, and often conceived by Rösing, yet his name would not necessarily attach itself to every decision they made, every convoy they tracked, every moment they held their boat steady against a depth-charge barrage. The relationship between mentor and student in military command carries particular weight, perhaps because it exists in an arena where mistakes can be measured in death. When Rösing trained a young officer, he was not merely conveying information, though that mattered. He was transmitting a way of seeing the world beneath the waves, a perspective that balanced audacity with prudence, that recognized fear as a useful counselor rather than an enemy to be conquered. A captain who had absorbed this philosophy would know when to strike and when to hide, and, perhaps more importantly, he would know that sometimes the profoundest act of leadership was knowing the difference. It might be ventured that Rösing's greatest strategic contribution to the German U-boat war was not in tonnage sunk under his own command, though the record of U-48 was certainly respectable, but rather in the multiplication of his own competence through others. Each well-trained captain who understood his principles could potentially extend the effective reach of German undersea warfare by months or years. It was not a consciously stated strategy, perhaps, but rather the natural result of a professional officer bringing his full intelligence and experience to bear on a teaching role at a critical moment in the war. The aces who emerged from his training represented a kind of echo, not a copy, but a resonance, each one distinct in personality and method, yet carrying within their tactical approaches the fundamental truths that Rösing had distilled from years of danger and careful observation. When we consider the names that appear in histories of the U-boat war, the celebrated captains, the legendary patrols, the tonnage destroyed, it is worth remembering that behind many of these achievements stood not only the captain and crew directly involved, but also the officer who had prepared them, guided their thinking, and helped them understand that professional excellence was the only weapon against the consuming uncertainty of underwater warfare. The debt owed to such teaching rarely appears in the official records, yet it pulses quietly through every successful patrol, every crew brought safely home, every calculated decision made in darkness 200 meters beneath the Atlantic swells. By the middle years of the war, something had begun to shift in the Atlantic. Not all at once, but with the creeping inevitability of fog rolling across dark water. The U-boats were still hunting, still sinking ships, still operating in formations that Rösing had helped to train and perfect, and yet the mathematics of their advantage had begun to move in the opposite direction. The Allies, those distant and determined enemies, had developed something that the U-boat commanders at first did not fully understand, and when understanding came, it came with a cold realization that would weigh upon every decision Rösing made from his desk in the occupied territories of France. Radar. The simple word contains multitudes of trouble for a submarine at the surface. For years, the U-boats had owned the night. They surfaced under cover of darkness, their low profiles nearly invisible to even the watchful eye of a circling convoy escort. The wolf packs would maneuver into position, attack from the blackness, and dive away to safety before the merchant ships and their protectors could effectively respond. Speed on the surface, silence below. It was a rhythm that had served them well, a dance between hunter and hunted that favored the patient predator. But now the escorts carried instruments that could see through the darkness, that could paint the shape of a submarine on a glowing screen, even when the human eye perceived nothing but the void. Rösing understood what this meant before many of his younger commanders grasped it. The advantage of invisibility was eroding. The vulnerability became acute when aircraft entered the equation in numbers sufficient to truly matter. A Liberator, a Sunderland, or a Wellington, appearing above the waves where moments before there had been nothing but open sky, could reduce a U-boat's chances of survival to something approaching desperation. A submarine on the surface is fast relative to a vessel underwater, but it is catastrophically slow compared to an aeroplane. The pilots hunted them with increasing skill, and the anti-submarine tactics of the Allies grew more precise, more coordinated, more relentless with each passing month. What had once been a relatively orderly war of commerce raiding was becoming something altogether more chaotic and brutal. In the bases under Rösing's administration, he watched the casualty lists grow, not in the abstract way that statistics can be absorbed and filed away, but in the personal knowledge of who was missing. The captain who had come to him for advice before his first patrol, the young officer who had shown such promise in the training course, the entire crew of a boat that had put to sea with careful efficiency and never reported in. These were not distant losses but names with faces, men whose shortcomings and strengths he had often assessed himself during their time ashore. The human cost of the war's turning tide was not something that happened elsewhere, to other men in other services. It was happening to his crews, the ones he had mentored, the ones he bore some responsibility for sending into waters that grew more perilous with every passing week. What must have passed through his mind during these years was a particular kind of sorrow, one that emerges when a man understands that the system he has invested his life in is slowly being defeated, not by sudden catastrophe, but by the steady accumulation of disadvantage. The U-boat arm was still formidable, still dangerous, still capable of sinking ships and inflicting loss on the Allies, but it was beginning to ask too much of its crews and to return less in exchange for that sacrifice. The odds that had once favored the hunter had tilted toward the hunted. A submarine leaving port in 1943 or 1944 was statistically far more likely to be lost than one that had departed 2 or 3 years earlier. Every commander knew this. Every young officer training in the bases that Rösing oversaw understood, at some level of consciousness, that they were being prepared for a war that was being lost. And yet they trained as though victory remained possible. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the latter war years to contemplate. The routines continued, the discipline held. The crews still learned their craft with meticulous attention to detail, because in a submarine, a moment of inattention could be fatal, regardless of whether the war was being won or lost. A faulty valve, an error in depth calculation, a miscalculation in the approach to a convoy, these things killed men with absolute indifference to the broader fortunes of war. The technical excellence required did not diminish simply because the strategic situation had altered. From his vantage point in the training command, Rösing was in the position of knowing more than most about how dire the situation had become. Reports flowed across his desk. statistical summaries were prepared. The tonnage sunk versus the losses sustained was analyzed with increasing frequency, and the gap between input and output grew wider with each quarter that passed. The investment in human capital and material resources was being consumed at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. He would have understood this not as theory, but as lived experience, felt in the knowledge that fewer men were returning from patrols and more crews were arriving for training, knowing that statistical probability suggested they would not survive their first deployment. The Allies' growing dominance in the air above the Atlantic was perhaps the single most significant factor in this reversal, where once a U-boat on the surface could see an approaching aircraft as a small speck and dive to safety with time to spare. Now the margin of warning had compressed dangerously. Technology advanced with a pace that the German naval command could not match. The depth charges became more effective, the anti-submarine tactics more sophisticated, and the cooperation between air and sea forces more seamless. A U-boat that had been forced to submerge in daylight had perhaps a few hours of limited visibility, constrained by battery power and the need to find a convoy beneath the surface. The hunting grounds that had once promised weeks of productive patrols were becoming killing zones. The mounting human cost of this technological disadvantage was perhaps most keenly felt in the training bases under Rösing's command. He would have seen the faces of men who knew their odds were worsening. The younger officers, the conscripted petty officers, the men who had joined the submarine service in the earlier days when it seemed like a rational career choice, all of them were becoming increasingly aware that the U-boat fleet was being asked to accomplish something that was becoming less and less possible. The morale of those preparing for deployment could not have remained entirely unaffected by this knowledge, even if they maintained the outward discipline and professionalism that the service demanded. What perspective Rösing might have developed during these years about the nature of leadership in a failing war is worth considering, though it must remain somewhat speculative. A man who had helped to train the officers who were now dying in increasing numbers would have faced a particular moral weight. He was, in a very real sense, responsible for their preparation, their confidence, their readiness to face challenges that were becoming impossible. Did he question the continuation of the effort, knowing as he must have known that the losses were mounting toward catastrophe? Did he seek ways to preserve his experienced crews for some future resurrection of the U-boat arm? Did he simply continue with the task assigned to him, training the next generation of commanders with the same care and precision he had always employed, understanding that this was the only meaningful contribution he could make? The documentation of these years, preserved in memory and occasional records, suggests a man who remained committed to the mission of training, who maintained standards, who did not allow the broader despair to diminish his focus on preparing officers who would command boats and crews into battle. And yet alongside that commitment must have existed a quiet awareness that time itself was becoming an enemy, that the window in which the U-boat war might have been conclusively won was closing, and that the losses mounting in the Atlantic would eventually become unsustainable. The balance between these two understandings, the duty to train and the knowledge of futility, is perhaps the most human aspect of Rösing's war, and it is one that would have deepened in these middle years as the fortunes of the U-boat arm shifted inexorably toward defeat. By the autumn of 1942, the mathematical weight of the Atlantic War had begun to shift in ways that could no longer be hidden from anyone watching the charts in the operations rooms of the Kriegsmarine. Hans-Rudolf Rösing, standing in his administrative offices in occupied France, would have felt this pivot not as a sudden rupture, but as a slow, deepening pressure, the kind that builds in your chest when you read reports month after month and see the same pattern crystallize into an inescapable truth. The waters that had once belonged almost entirely to German submarines, where lone wolves could hunt with something approaching impunity, were becoming increasingly dangerous, increasingly crowded with enemies you could not see. The introduction of effective Allied radar, particularly the centimetric wavelengths that German detection equipment could not yet perceive, meant that U-boats, which surfaced under cover of darkness for their nightly hunts, now faced attacks from aircraft they had no warning of. What had been a lethal advantage, the ability to hunt on the surface at night, invisible to conventional detection, became something closer to a death sentence. And there was more. The convoy escorts were growing more numerous, more coordinated, more aggressive. The long-range Liberator aircraft, capable of covering vast stretches of the mid-Atlantic where the submarines had once found refuge, were appearing with greater frequency. The wolf pack tactics that had so devastated shipping in 1940 and 1941 were becoming riskier by the month, as coordinated Allied response to U-boat signals grew swifter and more lethal. Rösing understood this landscape with the clarity that comes from both direct experience and from the clinical evidence of casualty reports crossing his desk. He had commanded a U-boat in the years of relative success, had felt the exhilaration of early victories, but he was not a man prone to sentiment when it came to reading evidence. The losses were mounting exponentially. Where once a U-boat might make 2 or 3 successful patrols and return to base with most of its crew intact, crews were now being lost to causes their commanding officers could scarcely have anticipated or defended against. A sudden flare of radar-guided gunfire in the darkness. A convoy escort that turned toward a sonar contact with mathematical precision, air patrols that had somehow predicted where the submarines would surface. By 1943, the tide had shifted so thoroughly that even those officers who had been reluctant to admit it found the reality inescapable. The Bismarck was long gone, sunk in 1941, but the loss of surface warships had become almost abstract compared to the daily hemorrhaging of submarine crews. In some months, the Kriegsmarine was losing U-boats at rates that made replacement and crew training seem almost futile. And yet Rösing's position as Führer der Unterseeboote West, as the commander overseeing U-boat operations from the French bases, meant that his responsibility was precisely to continue that which seemed to grow more futile with each passing week. He could not order the war to stop. He could only decide how to manage it, how to deploy his resources, how to sacrifice his people. This is where a particular kind of quiet transformation seems to have occurred in Rösing's thinking, though it is difficult to say exactly when or how deliberately it developed. Perhaps it began as a simple practical matter. If the odds were changing, if the survival rate for U-boat crews was declining, then the preservation of experienced commanders and experienced crews became not merely a humane concern, but a tactical necessity. A newly trained captain, fresh from the training flotillas, might have learned the mechanics of submarine command in theory, but he had not yet developed the instincts that kept men alive in moments of extreme stress. He did not yet know the precise moment when evasive action needed to shift from defensive to aggressive, or when the silence at depth needed to be absolute and unbreakable. The men around him, the engineers and hydroplane operators, and radio operators, and torpedo men, had not developed the intuitive coordination that separated successful crews from those that became statistic. Consider the simple mathematics of attrition. A U-boat with a seasoned crew might make 4 or 5 patrols under increasingly difficult conditions, losing perhaps half its personnel, but returning with enough survivors to be redistributed and reformed into new crews. That same U-boat, crewed by men with less than a year of operational experience, might not return at all, and the knowledge and instinct embedded in its command structure would be erased from the moment of its loss. From this perspective, the question of how to manage the training flotillas and the deployment of new crews became not simply an administrative concern, but perhaps the most strategic decision available to Rösing in the declining phase of the war. The shift in his responsibilities had, in some sense, positioned him perfectly for this role. While he was no longer commanding his own vessel and leading men into battle directly, he was shaping the decisions that determined which men would go to sea and when, which captains would receive additional training before deployment, and which crews might be rotated out of frontline service before they were completely exhausted. It was a different kind of command, quieter and less visible than the dramatic victories of the earlier war. but perhaps more consequential in its own way. Through the winter of 1943 and into 1944, as the losses continued and the predictions of the future grew steadily darker, Rösing seems to have become increasingly focused on a kind of salvage operation. Not salvage in the sense of rescuing the war that was beyond anyone's reach, but salvage in the sense of preserving the institutional knowledge of the U-boat arm, protecting the experienced men who might otherwise have been thrown into impossible situations, and perhaps, in some unspoken way, trying to ensure that if the war were eventually lost, there would be men who survived it, who understood why and how. The memoirs and recollections that survive from this period suggest that Rösing became something approaching a quiet protector of his crews. This did not mean ordering them not to fight, that was never an option, but it meant making careful decisions about which boats would be deployed under which conditions, which captains would receive additional resources or support, and which men might be held back from the most catastrophically dangerous missions. In an institution built on hierarchy and obedience, where orders from Berlin flowed downward with absolute authority, exercising this kind of quiet judgment was itself a form of resistance, though perhaps not resistance in the dramatic sense. What one can sense, looking back through the fragmentary records of these years, is a man becoming increasingly aware of the vast gulf between the war as it was being directed from the highest levels of the Nazi state and the war as it was actually being fought in the cold waters of the Atlantic. At the strategic level, there were orders for new wonder weapons, for submarines that would somehow turn the tide. At the tactical level, there were demands for more patrols, more attacks, more tonnage sunk. But at the level where Rösing worked, overseeing the training bases and the movement of crews, there was an accumulating awareness that the underlying mathematical reality could not be escaped through better tactics or more aggressive deployment. The question that must have haunted him, as it haunted many commanders in these years, was not whether the war could be won, that seemed increasingly improbable even to the most optimistic, but how many men would have to die in the process of losing it. And what responsibility did he bear, as a man in a position of limited authority, for managing that toll? These were not the kinds of questions that could be asked openly in the Nazi military structure, where defeatism was not merely demoralizing, but potentially treasonous. But they were the questions that men like Rösing had to wrestle with silently, day after day, as casualty reports accumulated on their desks. The grey Atlantic, which had once been a hunting ground, was becoming a graveyard, and Rösing, in his quiet way, seemed to be asking himself what role he might play in determining who would and would not be sent down into it. The waters off the French coast grew quieter in those final months, though quiet was perhaps a merciful word for what had become an arithmetic of loss. By early 1945, the Atlantic that had once belonged to the grey wolves of the Kriegsmarine had turned hostile in ways no amount of courage or training could overcome. The Allies had woven a net of radar and aircraft so dense that a surfaced U-boat was no longer a hunter but prey, and Rösing, stationed in the bases he had helped build and command, understood this calculus with the clarity of a man who had spent 5 years reading the sea's moods. The winter of 44 into 45 brought a peculiar strain to his work. He was no longer commanding a vessel, but commanding men who were departing on vessels they might not return from, and the weight of that knowledge, once abstract in the way all future dangers are abstract, had become crushingly material. Each young captain who left his office for patrol had likely spent time under Rösing's eye, had learned his methods, had absorbed his emphasis on discipline and precision. Some had become aces in their own right, bearing his influence like an invisible current beneath their own command style. Now those same men were heading into waters where even excellence offered no guarantee of survival. The bases themselves, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, began to feel less like operational centers and more like monuments to a war that was already, in the minds of those who understood the mathematics, already lost. The massive concrete bunkers that housed the U-boats had proven nearly impervious to bombing, a grim testament to German engineering and paranoia in equal measure. But the bunkers could not protect what floated beyond them. What did a bomb-proof shelter matter when the Atlantic itself had become a killing ground? The question hung unspoken in Rösing's daily rounds, in the reports that crossed his desk with increasing frequency, in the lists of boats that had departed and would never transmit another signal. There is a particular loneliness in being an administrator at the twilight of an enterprise you once commanded from within. Rösing had tasted combat, had felt the vibration of diesel engines through the steel walls that surrounded him, had known the simplicity and terrible clarity of a man hunting or being hunted. Paperwork, personnel reports, training schedules, these were not the same thing, even when they mattered, perhaps especially when they mattered. And they did matter, because the quality of a U-boat crew's preparation still influenced whether they might survive their first encounter with a convoy or an escort vessel. A man well trained in damage control, in the choreography of torpedo launches, in the discipline of silence, such a man had a marginally better chance. Marginally. The word says everything about those final months. By April of 45, the Third Reich itself was entering its death convulsion. The Red Army was closing from the east, the Western Allies from the west, and the map of German territorial control had become almost unrecognizable from what it had been even a year prior. Rösing's bases, so carefully fortified, suddenly existed in a strange suspended state, technically German territory still held by German forces, but surrounded by approaching enemies, supplied by collapsing logistics, commanded by a government that had ceased to govern anything beyond the bunker, in which Hitler's will had become pure fantasy. The Kriegsmarine, as an institution, had already begun to fragment into competing interests. Some commanders spoke of continuing to fight, of holding out in the Atlantic fortresses indefinitely, of mounting some last stand that existed more fully in rhetoric than in any practical assessment of fuel, ammunition, and crew morale. Others recognized what Rösing had likely recognized months earlier. The war was finished, had been finished since perhaps the moment the first submarine sank under radar-guided depth charges, had been finished in the moment when the Allies' capacity to build ships exceeded the U-boat's capacity to sink them. The sinking continued because it always does until someone issues the order to stop. In early May, as German forces surrendered piecemeal across Europe, Rösing faced a decision that perhaps no training, no cadet academy, no years of command experience could have truly prepared him for. What does an officer do when the nation he has served and the navy he has devoted his adult life to advancing simply cease to exist as functioning entities? The question carried an almost philosophical weight, but it was also deeply practical. There were U-boats still in the bases under his command. There were men who would have followed his orders into almost any circumstance. There were resources, still, however depleted. The British were offering terms of surrender. The Americans had their own conditions. The Soviets, naturally, wanted German naval personnel and technology brought into their own sphere, and the war, in its final gasps, had become as much about negotiating the terms of one's own post-war fate as it was about any lingering military objective. Rösing, facing the Allies' advance, made the choice that would define his post-war life. He negotiated the peaceful transition of the U-boat bases to Allied control, ensured that the boats were surrendered intact, and attempted to preserve both the lives of the men under his command and their prospects for something resembling a future. It was not heroic in any traditional sense. There was no last stand, no dramatic last patrol, no glorious final battle. There was, instead, the careful choreography of surrender, the meticulous documentation of materials, the protection of men from summary judgment, or the vengeful impulses that war sometimes leaves in its wake. Some have suggested that Rösing used his administrative position and his careful relationships with his subordinates to shield officers and men from the worst excesses of occupation and investigation. Others note that he cooperated fully with Allied authorities, recognizing that the future belonged to those who could credibly demonstrate they had not been irredeemable true believers in the regime that had just collapsed. The transition was strange and muted, as such things often are. There were no formal ceremonies marking the end of the Kriegsmarine's undersea war, no moment when a flag was lowered and another raised, at least not in the places where Rösing stood. There was instead the slow draining away of authority, the replacement of German officers by Allied ones, the gradual transformation of military installations into prisoner-of-war camps, interrogation centers, or storage facilities for captured equipment. The U-boats themselves, sleek instruments of war that had been crewed by men who had learned their trade in part from Rösing's teachings, were seized, studied, divided among the victors, or scuttled into the Atlantic they had once prowled so effectively. For a man of Rösing's generation and experience, this transition carried a particular sting. He had been shaped by the Kriegsmarine, had believed in its traditions and its possibilities, had served it with genuine professionalism, even as the larger ideological nightmare it was embedded in had become increasingly apparent. The surrender meant not just the end of a war, but the end of an identity, the dissolution of institutions to which he had devoted decades of his life. And yet, almost uniquely among senior U-boat officers, Rösing's reputation seemed to emerge from the war's end, not diminished, but perhaps even subtly enhanced. He had not been a fanatical true believer. He had not been a war criminal or a perpetrator of atrocities. He had been, according to most accounts, a professional who had done his duty as he understood it, and who had used his position at the war's end to mitigate unnecessary suffering. The post-war months found him in a curious liminal space, not prosecuted, not imprisoned, but not fully free either. There were interrogations by the Allies, debriefing sessions where his knowledge of U-boat operations, training methods, and personnel were of considerable interest to the victors. The Americans, in particular, were eager to understand the mechanics of the U-boat war, the training systems that had produced effective commanders, the organizational structures that had enabled the Kriegsmarine's undersea campaign. In these interviews, Rösing became a kind of living archive, his memories and insights transformed into intelligence documents that would shape post-war naval thinking. Yet even in these debriefings, there was something of the gentleness that had perhaps always characterized Rösing's approach to command and professional life. He was not defensive, not attempting to minimize his role or distance himself from the institution he had served. He was thoughtful, measured, willing to acknowledge failures and strategic mistakes without descending into self-recrimination. In a post-war world hungry for villains and eager to assign moral categories neatly, heroes and villains, perpetrators and victims, there was something almost disconcerting about an officer who seemed to occupy some third category, one that acknowledged complexity without excusing complicity. The Atlantic grew calmer as summer came that year. The U-boats that had terrorized convoys for 6 years were now either at the bottom of the ocean, in Allied custody, or scuttled deliberately to prevent their capture. The men who had served in them were prisoners of war, or dispersed into the vast, displaced person camps that had become the holding pattern for millions of Europeans in the war's aftermath. Rösing, for his part, entered into what would be the longest and perhaps most consequential phase of his life, the phase of remembrance, reflection, and the careful cultivation of memory itself. He would live for decades after the war's end, watching how the U-boat campaign was remembered, debated, and mythologized in the historical accounts that began to accumulate. And it is perhaps fitting that a man who had spent so much of his life shaping institutions and training others would spend his post-war decades shaping how that era would be understood, not through written propaganda or self-serving narratives, but through conversations, interviews, and the patient work of memory maintained with honesty and care. The war ended not with fanfare, but with silence. For Hans-Rudolf Rösing, that silence came in May of 1945, when the Atlantic stopped asking questions, and the grey waters that had been his entire adult life became, quite suddenly, a place of memory rather than purpose. He was 43 years old. Behind him lay a career that spanned the full arc of modern submarine warfare, from its clandestine infancy in the 20s to its twilight as an instrument of a collapsing regime. Before him lay something far more uncertain, a life in which he would have to learn, slowly, to think of himself as a man who had been, rather than as a man who was. The immediate aftermath of surrender was confusion and displacement, as it was for so many German naval officers. Rösing spent time in various camps, processed and interrogated like countless others, his record examined by men who were trying to understand not just what he had done, but what kind of man could do it. But unlike many of his contemporaries who would vanish into obscurity or into the Soviet gulag, Rösing carried something with him that the post-war world would eventually value, not notoriety, but knowledge. He had trained men who had become legends. He understood the technical and human dimensions of submarine warfare in ways that few living officers could match, and he possessed something rarer still, the capacity to reflect on his own experience with a kind of clear-eyed honesty that transcended the propaganda he had once served. In the years that followed, as Germany was divided and occupied and slowly began to rebuild itself as something new, Rösing found his way into conversations about the war that had just ended. He spoke with historians and naval scholars. He wrote. He gave interviews. Not to justify what had been done, there was little room in the post-war world for that kind of apology, but to explain it, to make clear, in the plainest language, how a dedicated naval officer had carried out orders in a war that had seemed, from the perspective of the Atlantic, less like ideology and more like a competition of machines and tactics and nerve. He wrote about the technical achievements of the U-boat program, about the training methods that had produced such remarkably effective crews, about the way the war at sea had actually been fought rather than the way it was remembered in propaganda films. What emerged from these reflections was not a comfortable figure, but an honest one. Rösing did not claim that he had been unaware of the regime's nature. He did not pretend that serving in Hitler's navy was a neutral technical exercise. But he spoke about the compartmentalization that was possible in war, the way a man focused on keeping his crew alive and his boat hidden beneath the surface could live, for months at a time, in a world that was almost entirely removed from the grand historical machinery grinding away above. Whether that was an excuse or simply an explanation, the difference between those two things occupied much of his post-war thinking. What the historical record eventually came to emphasize, however, was not Rösing's command record, which was substantial but ultimately not remarkable in the context of the many aces who had served. Rather, it was his role as a mentor and shaper of doctrine. The men he had trained, Günther Hessler, Reinhard Hardigan, Erich Topp, these were the names that lived on in the histories of the U-boat war. These were the commanders whose boats sank tonnage, who became household names in Germany, who were remembered as the faces of an era. But behind each of their achievements lay training, doctrine, tactical instruction, an understanding of what was possible and what was too dangerous. Some of that came from Rösing, more of it than most people realized. History, in its way, forgot him in order to remember those he had trained. This was perhaps inevitable. The warrior is always more visible than the teacher. The man who sinks a ship is more memorable than the man who taught the sinking. The ace who has his face in photographs is easier to remember than the administrator whose name appears in training records and orders of the day. And yet, if you follow the chain backward far enough, if you trace the knowledge and the confidence and the tactical innovations that made the legendary U-boat captains what they were, you will find Rösing somewhere in the current, not always in the obvious place, not always with his name prominently attached, but there nonetheless. In his later years, living in the Federal Republic, Rösing became something like a guardian of memory. He spoke to younger historians who were trying, with increasing distance and objectivity, to understand what the submarine war had really been. He corrected misconceptions. He provided details that only a man who had lived through it could know: the sound of a hull groaning under pressure, the taste of recycled air, the particular quality of silence that comes when you are hidden beneath 1,000 tons of water and every man on board is holding his breath. He wrote accounts of specific patrols, specific decisions. He was careful, always, to acknowledge that he was writing from a single perspective, that his memory was shaped by what he had experienced, and perhaps by what he preferred to remember. The question of how to remember the U-boat war became, for post-war Germany, a delicate matter. These had been, after all, men fighting for a regime whose crimes were being slowly revealed to a shocked world. And yet they had also been sailors, ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, bound together by the particular intimacy of submarine life. Rösing walked that line carefully. He never romanticized what had been done. He never claimed that technical excellence in service of a terrible cause was somehow separate from the terribleness, but he insisted that the men themselves, the engineers and radio men and torpedo men who had done their jobs with remarkable skill, deserved to be remembered as human beings rather than simply as servants of a dark historical moment. As the decades passed and the 20th century moved further away from the Second World War, Rösing's reputation settled into a particular niche. He became known, among those who studied naval history, as a man of intelligence and integrity. His interviews were sought out, his writings were consulted. When scholars wanted to understand not just what had happened in the Atlantic, but how a carefully trained group of men had been able to accomplish it, they found themselves turning back to Rösing's accounts, his reflections on training, his clear-eyed descriptions of what it took to forge a U-boat crew. The distinction that history eventually drew was subtle but important. There were the aces, the men with the confirmed sinkings, the records, the names that appeared in the history books. And then there was Rösing, the man behind many of them, the officer who had understood that the real battle was not won or lost in any single engagement, but rather in the months before a captain ever took his boat to sea. It was won in training rooms and in careful instruction. It was won when a young officer began to understand not just how to fire a torpedo, but how to think like a hunter, how to read the subtle signs of the ocean, how to keep his men calm when danger was closest. Some men are remembered for what they did. Others are remembered for what they taught others to do. Rösing, after the war, became increasingly aware that he belonged to the latter category. The boats he had commanded were sunk or scrapped. The patrols he had led became numbers in a ledger of tonnage and statistics. But the officers he had shaped, the lessons he had imparted, the doctrine he had helped to develop, these lived on in how the war was understood and remembered. In a strange way, perhaps the most fitting epitaph for a man like Rösing was not a list of his own achievements, but a recognition of how thoroughly his influence had woven itself into the fabric of what others accomplished. In his final years, as he grew older and the war became not recent memory but distant history, Rösing seemed to accept this gradually fading prominence with something like philosophical calm. He had been a witness to one of history's great technological and human dramas. He had played a real role in it. That role had been neither heroic nor villainous, but rather competent, careful, and ultimately shaped by circumstances that no individual could have controlled. He had done his job well. He had trained men well. He had survived when so many others had not. What more could a man ask for, when everything had ended, and the only question left was how to be remembered? The Atlantic, in its vastness, keeps many secrets. Those grey swells that roll without ceasing, that break against the hulls of merchant ships and naval vessels alike, have absorbed the sounds of men's last words, the final transmissions of steel vessels sliding beneath the surface, the mechanical groans of submarines caught between the surface world and the depths below. And somewhere within that immensity, within the memory held by salt and current, and the slow descent through cold water, lies the echo of a man who shaped the fate of others through his counsel, his discipline, his quiet understanding of what it meant to send young men toward uncertain horizons. Hans-Rudolf Rösing never fired the greatest number of torpedoes. He never claimed the largest tonnage of sunken ships. He did not live through the war as a celebrated ace whose name was broadcast to rally a nation's hope in the later, darker years. Instead, he moved through history like a figure observed through fog, present, influential, yet somehow less vivid than those he guided toward legend. And perhaps that absence of fanfare, that displacement from the glittering world of individual triumph, is the truest measure of what he became, a vessel for knowledge, a keeper of discipline, a man whose greatest victories were won not in the moment of attack, but in the months before, in the careful instruction of others. The sea does not remember nations or ideologies. It does not distinguish between the righteous and the condemned. It simply opens and closes, rises and falls, taking what is given to it and holding it in silence. The submarines that Rösing commanded, the ones he oversaw in their construction and commissioning, the young captains whose minds he shaped in the classrooms and briefing rooms of occupied France, these are all part of that vast indifference now, folded into history the way sand folds around a dropped object, becoming, over time, indistinguishable from the rest. What remains is a kind of quieter immortality, not the thunderous fame of the U-boat captains whose tonnage figures were recorded and celebrated, whose names entered the popular imagination as raiders and hunters. Rather, a more subtle legacy, the knowledge that somewhere in the chain of command that led from the secretive U-boat schools to the moment a captain pressed the firing mechanism, Rösing's presence was woven through. His teachings echoed in the minds of men who would later become famous in their own right. His standards of professionalism, his insistence on discipline and precision, rippled outward through the years and across the U-boat fleet in ways that were never publicly attributed to him, never counted on a scorecard, never announced in propaganda broadcasts. Memory is a curious thing beneath the sea. The water preserves some things and destroys others. The wrecks of U-boats lie scattered across the ocean floor, many of them still unvisited, their interiors undisturbed by human eyes for decades. In some of those dark, pressurized compartments, the records remain: logbooks, technical drawings, orders written in the precise hand of submarine commanders. But the living memory, the recollection of the men who served in those vessels, the conversations held in the control room during long hours of patrol, the whispered fears and quiet solidarities formed in the darkness, all of that has risen and dissipated, becoming part of the atmosphere itself, no more recoverable than the last breath drawn by a man lost to the depths. There is a specific kind of loneliness that accompanies a life spent in training others, in standing slightly apart from the action, in bearing responsibility for outcomes that are never fully one's own. Rösing knew this loneliness. He knew it in the final years of the war, when the young men he had taught were being sent into increasingly impossible circumstances, when the odds had shifted so dramatically against them that the best teaching in the world could not guarantee survival. He knew it in the knowledge that his careful instruction had been thorough, disciplined, rigorous, and ultimately insufficient against the tide of history. Yet there is also a dignity in that position. The man who teaches is, in a sense, immortalized through his students. Their successes carry forward his methods. Their failures, if they come, at least come from the foundation of his instruction, rather than from ignorance. When a U-boat captain who had passed through Rösing's training course made a critical decision in a moment of sudden danger, part of that decision-making process carried the ghost of a lesson learned months or years before, in a classroom in France, whispered by a man whose face the captain might have forgotten, but whose voice, his emphasis on precision and readiness, would have remained somewhere beneath the surface of consciousness. The war ended. The submarines were surrendered, razed, scuttled, sunk, or simply left to rust in harbors that no longer belonged to the nation that built them. The men dispersed. Some were captured, interrogated, held in prisoner of war camps. Some disappeared entirely into the chaos of defeat and surrender. Others, like Rösing, gradually reintegrated into a world that was trying, with difficulty and uncertainty, to forget what had happened and to build something new from the rubble. In the decades that followed, Rösing lived on. He watched as historians began the slow work of piecing together the history of the U-boat war, interviewing survivors, sifting through records, reconstructing the chronology of engagements and losses. His name appeared in some of those histories, usually in a supporting role. Rösing commanded U-48. Rösing later oversaw training. Rösing survived the war. But the arc of his life, the depth of his influence, the countless moments of decision and instruction that shaped the careers of others, these remained largely outside the public narrative, preserved only in the specialized knowledge of naval historians and in the memories, now fading with each passing year, of the men he had taught. One might ask, in the quiet hours before sleep, what becomes of such a life? What does it mean to have shaped the fates of others, to have transmitted knowledge and discipline forward through time, and then to gradually fade from the collective memory? Perhaps it means that the truest legacies are the ones most difficult to measure. The impact of a teacher is diffuse, indirect, impossible to quantify, with the precision that a warship's tonnage sunk, or a convoy intercepted, or a battle won might be quantified. It spreads outward like ripples in water, touching people and places far from the point of origin, and then dissipating into the general movement of history itself. The sea, in its patience, knows something of this. It receives the impact of what falls into it, absorbs it, and continues its eternal motion as though nothing had occurred. The currents move the wreckage apart. The pressure and the salt reshape what remains. Time itself becomes a kind of mercy, gradually softening the sharp edges of memory, making it easier to live in the world that comes after catastrophe. Hans-Rudolf Rösing lived to see a very different world. The Germany he served was unmade. The ideology it carried was discredited. The navy he had dedicated his life to was, like so much else, scattered to the winds of history. And yet, in his own quiet way, he persisted. He carried forward his knowledge. He contributed to the historical record. He bore witness to what had transpired. These are smaller things than the command of ships or the direction of great military campaigns, but they are things that matter, things that carry weight beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. Perhaps that is the final meditation that the sea offers to those who listen carefully. That the loudest voices are not always the ones that echo longest, that the greatest victories are sometimes won in the spaces between action, in the patience of preparation, in the unseen transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. That a life lived in the service of others, even in the context of a terrible war, even in the shadow of defeat, even when the larger cause itself is rightfully condemned, that such a life is not without meaning or dignity. The submarines, if they could speak, might tell us that they remember nothing. They are machines, instruments of human will and human ambition, and they carry no memory of their own. But the men who built them, who commanded them, who trained others to command them, those men carried memory forward, passed it along, embedded it in the choices of others. And that, perhaps, is as close to immortality as any of us come, not in being remembered by name in the final reckoning, but in having shaped, however subtly, the thoughts and actions of those who came after. The Atlantic still rolls, its swells still break against the hulls of ships. The pressure still mounts with every meter of descent into the blue, and somewhere in the vast indifference of that water, in the darkness that knows no politics, no history, no ideology, somewhere there, the traces of what once was continue their slow dissolution, becoming, over the course of decades and centuries, simply part of the sea itself. And the world above the surface moves on, carrying forward the lessons learned, the prices paid, the quiet debts owed to those who stood at the threshold between knowing and unknowing, between teaching and acting, between the silence beneath the waves and the noise of history writing itself above. As sleep approaches, as consciousness gradually releases its grip on the waking world, one might imagine that silence, the profound, patient silence